we'll go ahead and get started. It's 1:59. I'll call us to order and ask if you have a cell phone, if you could mute that, please. Appreciate members of the board coming for a special work session. We have a regular scheduled board meeting starting tomorrow at 10 a.m., same location. So the purpose of this is really to spend a little time with the accountability model. We've asked our staff at the Department of Education. We have some other visitors joining us by Skype, as well as probably 20 or 30 visitors in the audience to have this conversation. Again, the major point of it is to provide an overview, kind of do a temperature check on where we are with the model. I consider this kind of as the step one, and what should be a process as we go along in an effort to continuously improve the accountability model, as we hear from practitioners, as policies from federal government, as the legislature directs, and as regulations dictate. You know, we just keep an open mind and always look for ways to improve the model and the way that it impacts our practitioners and our hundreds of thousands of students in the public school system in Mississippi. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Dr. Wright for opening remarks.
All right, thank you. Welcome to everybody. Just a couple of shifting of gears a little bit. When this work session was originally scheduled, it was originally scheduled to provide an update to the board on the strategic plan. And then when it was decided to move to the accountability model, I didn't want you to lose sight of the strategic plan. So what we're going to provide you today or tomorrow is the updated copy of the strategic plan. So that will give you the whole next month to take a look at it. And then we will add that to the agenda for November for discussion and then for action, because we wanted you to see the most updated part of what you have. In your packet, in your blue packet, you will see the PowerPoint that's going to be used. Right behind that, there are some backup materials that will be referenced during the presentation. And we want to welcome Dr. Christy Hovenitz via Skype. Unfortunately, Christy was not able to be with us today because of the weather. And we were just glad that you were able to make the Skype portion. And also welcome Senator Gray Tollison, who is the Ed Chair of our Senate Committee, and will be having remarks as well. So at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Vanderford, who is going to get us started. Dr. Vanderford. You have a blue packet? We need a blue packet over here. Ms. Altman does not have one.
Oh, should be on subcommittee, but.
Oh, no, Dr. Elam is here.
She's
going to need her packet.
Yes.
There you go, Ms. Altman.
Do you have one?
Does everybody have one? Oh, Mr. McClellan doesn't have one either. Make sure everybody's got the packet, because this will allow you to follow along on the PowerPoint and to take notes. Dr. Hovenitz, you've got our PowerPoint, do you not? Okay, good. All right, everybody has their documents. Okay. Dr. Vanderford, I'll turn it over to you. Just a reminder to everybody, this is being live streamed, so when board members have questions or people are at the table, please make sure that you've got the mic right in front of you.
Good afternoon. As you know, all of our presentations
Mic right in front of you.
always begin with the vision and the mission of State Board of Education, and of course that's to create a world-class educational system that gives students the knowledge that they need for both college and career. And the next slide, of course, as Dr. Wright previously mentioned regarding our State Board Strategic Plan, outlines all of the goals. And so we'll particularly be talking about goals 1, 2, and 6 throughout this presentation. The next slide briefly is just an agenda of how we'll go through the presentation. We'll begin with some background information about how we got to where we are today with the current model that we have. And then Senator Tollison will have some remarks regarding our A through F system And then Dr. Oakley will share some slides regarding the impact of accountability, which all relates to academic outcomes. And then Dr. Hovenich will join us to just overall, in general, talk about A through F grades and school accountability. And then Alan will close with the actual components of our current system. Slide 5 just briefly gives you a historical glance at the accountability systems that have been in effect since 1988. So as you know, the current model that we have and that we'll be discussing today was implemented in 2013. The next slide will just briefly outline some of the concerns, and I will provide a timeline for you related to the implementation of the new model. In your blue folder, you have a one-page document that just provides a diagram of what the previous model actually looked like. The performance component of the previous model was the Quality Distribution Index.
Let me just interrupt 1 second. It looks like this state accountability rating system. Just make sure that you've got, that's what Dr. Vanderford's speaking.
And then the two center columns on that document are related to the growth component of the previous model, where it was just met or not met, referred to as inadequate academic gain or appropriate academic gain. And the column to the far right is related to the high school completer index or the graduation rate. So in the previous model, the graduation rate was a 5-year graduation rate that was used. So in April of 2012, there were a number of districts that had expressed concerns about the previous model. And some of those concerns are outlined on slide 6, and we're not going to go through them in depth, but it was related to the index that was used to determine performance, the growth status, whether it was just met or not met, and a large part of the conversation was around the high school completion index and the graduation component. And there was a huge focus on the fact that the previous model was inequitable. And the reason that I've provided this document for you is because if you look at the document, you can see on the far right-hand column that the graduation rate or the high school completer index only applied to the schools and to the districts that were the highest performing. And so districts which are now rated successful, which is equivalent to a C or below, were not being held accountable in the model for graduation rate. And so for that, districts argued that it was inequitable because not all districts and schools were being held to the same standard regarding the graduation rate. At that time, we had a separate state and federal model, and there was a movement that most districts urged to combine and have one model. We had 7 performance descriptors that were very difficult for the general public to understand, and as you see, they're listed here. The STAR school or district is now what's equivalent to an A, and then from high performing to successful, academic watch, low performing, at risk of failing, and failing. And so there was, conversations, a lot of conversation around what does this mean. And then, of course, the last concern regarding our cuts on the previous MCT2 assessment. So when these concerns were presented to the Commission in April of 2012, the Commission made a recommendation that we move forward to the State Board of Education and ask for approval to establish an accountability task force that would address these concerns within our model. Also, at the time that the previous model was in place, there was it was in the accountability standards that we would continuously review and revise the model as necessary. And one of the requirements was that when this previous model was implemented, that after it had been implemented the first year, that the lower performing schools and districts would eventually be held accountable for the graduation component, but that was never incorporated into where all districts were held accountable. So there was a lot of conversation about not continuing to revise that model. So in May of 2012, the state board granted approval to establish the Accountability Task Force to take a look at these items that are on slide 6. In July of 2012, and the charge of the Accountability Task Force in May of 2012 was particularly around the graduation and the high school completer index component, and making that applicable for all schools and districts.
Just a very quick question. Educate us on the makeup of the task force.
It was practitioners at the time. We had teachers, principals. It's consistent with what we've done in the past too. That we currently do with that. So in July of 2012, after the task force was appointed and began looking at just the graduation component, quickly it was determined that there was a need to expand the scope of that accountability task force. So we came back to the board in July of 2012 and asked for permission to expand that scope. So at the same time that we were working to expand the scope of that task force and looking at the previous model, the legislative leadership was also engaged with the foundation in looking at what other states were doing nationally in moving to the A through F system. So at the time, Mr. Gilbert was the deputy that was over accountability. So we worked with the legislative leadership to join and form a partnership and expand the scope of the task force even further to include the legislative leadership with Chairman Tollison with the Senate and Chairman Moore at the time of the House, as well as representatives from the foundation. So rather than the agency working to modify this model and the legislative leadership working and looking toward moving to an A through F system, we combined efforts. So at this point, since Senator Tollison is here with us, I'll just ask him to offer a few remarks regarding the legislative leadership and the initiative to move to an A through F system.
You want to come to the table? Thank you.
Microphone. Thank y'all for inviting me to speak very briefly. I think Paula set it up exactly, and what drove this was the legislation to go to an A through F letter system to grade our schools and school districts. And the State Board of Education, in trying to implement that, and we learned, the legislature as well, that, as she said, the 7 indicators, the bottom 4 weren't even, they didn't consider graduation rates in the developing the formula, which made no sense to anybody. Why we were considering it for the top 3 levels, but not the bottom 4. And from that, as Paula explained, came the Accountability Task Force, and gave me and Chairman Moore at the time a lot of interest. And we both attended meetings here, hours upon hours, with the Accountability Task Force, developing a model, an accountability model, which you have the foundation of it today. And it relies upon the idea of what gets measured gets done. And I know y'all know the statistics, but one example is the acceleration component. And Oxford is an outstanding school district. Clinton, they always were offering accelerated advanced placement courses and things of that nature. But when you added this component, a lot of other school districts were too. And I think, double the number of advanced placement classes. We're focusing on ACT. So that is driving schools and school leaders to offer those courses, which is a policy issue. But to me, the accountability model, it informs instruction on the local level. It informs policy on the state level for the state board and for the legislature of grading this. And the devil's in the details, yes, but this accountability task force, I was there and I saw them. We were there hours and hours and hours and working and using these experts, psychometricians or whatever they're called, and I learned a lot, and it was very helpful. But you know, honestly, from what I'm told and what I think, we have one of the best accountability models in the nation. And I think the old model, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Paula, it used to just measure proficiency. But the good thing about this new model, it measures proficiency for those proficient students in Oxford, but it also measured growth of those children in Hollandale. So it's a fairer system than the old one used to be. I mean, you know, Oxford, they could sleep and make an A, or whatever the ranking was. I can't remember what it was now. In Hollandale, they couldn't get that proficiency level. Well, now they can. And I use the unofficial that I kept for myself, grades, and measured it against the poverty rate level of children aged 5 to 17. And it's really interesting to look at those C school districts, one of which Hollandale and Leland, where most of them are D and Fs. They're doing a lot of good things. And I want to, you know, celebrate what they're doing with the population that they have. But, you know, it's only if you measure proficiency and growth, and y'all will get into that detail. But anyway, I'm glad that we started this in 2012, and really it was the state board that put a halt to the old system and said, hey, we need to look at this and set up this accountability task force. I don't know if who was on, Dr. Kelly, you were on that board. So I'm glad that y'all did that. And yeah, and Mr. McClellan was here as well. And I'm glad they did that, and we kind of worked together, the legislature and the state board, of developing this plan. And it is where it is today, how many years later? 6 years later. So, but it's something that I think is so important for K-12 education to measure. And it's measure, as I said, not only individual students, but the schools and school districts, to look at who's doing well and who's not doing well, so we can focus on the resources on those schools that need the help the most. And unless we have that, a fair, accurate measure as best as we can do, we won't be able to reach that. And again, driving students and schools to do what needs to be done to lift up all our students, not just the students in the great school districts around the state. So thank y'all for letting me speak.
I just want to say, Senator, thank you for being here. You know, having someone like you here, and you know, seeing the audience and the concern that we have for the system, I think you get a real feel that, you know, the work that you've done to bring us to this point right now is really meaningful and has an impact. And our purpose here is really just to, you know, ensure that we're implementing it and executing it well into your wishes. So I want to say thank you for being here, first of all. And I also want to say this guy right here is a tremendous asset for, and probably the biggest advocate for education in the state legislature right now. He's toiled in the vineyards for a very long time over there, and I would say this about him: he's one of those rare guys that not only does he have a heart for education, but he has a mind for education. Every time I talk to this guy, I mean, what he knows and how he could just speak to the history and the rationale and the policy. So I know it's a long drive from Oxford, and I appreciate you being here and contributing to today's work session.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all for what y'all do.
Paula's coming up. I want to say one thing about that last bullet that's very important. Our old test actually did not measure, our cuts were not at proficient. And we've received a tremendous amount of notoriety, I shall say, early on, because when NAEP came out with their study, and there's a graph that I'll try and find and give to all of you, they mapped all of the states in the nation at what NAEP's cut of proficiency was, what their cut at basic was, and our cut was below basic. And yet, when we put out our data, we were saying X number of percentage of children were proficient in reading or proficient in math, when that simply was not the truth. So when we moved into Park, that was a measure of proficiency because that was the way that the test was designed. And then when we had to go from Park to our new assessment, that was part of the criteria. Because we got nailed in a couple of reports very early on about what they call the honesty gap. You're telling parents you've got 65 to 70% children proficient, and yet your cut is below basic. So we've changed all that, and we were recognized actually a year ago for doing the exact opposite. So now Mississippi is no longer in the position of having an honesty gap where our proficiency rates are compared to what NAEP is putting out as proficient. So that's a really important bullet because, as you know, looking when we get further, you're going to notice the number of buckets that proficiency and assessment results matter. And so it's important that we have an assessment that actually does measure proficiency. Paul, I'm going to turn that back over to you.
A couple of slides just answer the question as to why we have accountability. So our statewide accountability system establishes the set of minimum standards for districts and schools to ensure that our students are prepared for the workforce and or for post-secondary education. It also informs the public on how well schools and districts are performing. Our system considers how well students are performing on statewide assessments that are included within the system, and whether or not those students are showing improvements on those assessments from one year to the next. And then, of course, we have the graduation component that is currently the 4-year graduation rate. The accountability system drives behaviors of schools and districts that influence planning, as well as the interim measures of performance. The results in best practice, which results in best practices that can be seen in improvements on both statewide assessments as well as our national assessments, such as NAEP, that we'll talk about a little later on in the presentation. Currently, our statewide accountability system is a single A through F system that meets all of the applicable state and federal laws, and the code section is 3717.6, and it was section 5 that was added in the legislation. It was approved by the Board of Education in January of 2014. And we're going to have some future slides that outline the current or the membership of the 1718 Accountability Task Force, but we want to talk about how our system is developed. And in some of the public comments or the APA comments that you received in the last couple of months, there was a little bit, there were some misconceptions throughout some of those that indicate that agency staff, or the MDE, is the one that is charged with the development of the model. We actually, the MDE staff, serve as agents to provide data to the Accountability Task Force when it is requested. So the model was actually developed by practitioners that serve on these task force, and then as we talk time and time again about the process, we move through from the Accountability Task Force to the Technical Advisory Committee, and then to the Commission on School Accreditation and State Board of Education. But as we referenced earlier with the development of this model, we also had state legislative leaders engaged in the process. Slide 11 just briefly highlights the components that at a minimum must be included in our statewide accountability system to comply with state statute. Again, it has to be a single A through F system. It must combine the state and federal accountability systems into one system that must be federally approved. It established 5 performance categories, A through F. We were charged with discontinuing the use of the 7 indicators that previously mentioned. The statute also assigned, it took the 7 former performance classifications and then aligned them with the A through F system. We had to incorporate a standards-based growth model and discontinue the use of the Quality Distribution Index. We were charged with using the federal 4-year graduation rate, and was also had to discontinue the use of the High School Completer Index. And then there's also a requirement that we increase the standards when 75% of the students are proficient and or when 65% of the schools and districts earn a grade of a B or higher. The next couple of slides are just included for your information. This is the 1718 Accountability Task Force members that served. We're currently in the process of selecting and finalizing the membership of the 1819 Accountability Task Force that will meet within the next month. The slide 13 outlines the...
Dr. Vanderburg,
yes, sir.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
I don't want to be disruptive, but the people who served on 1718 Accountability Task Force, how do they come to serve on that task force?
There's
is it something you are nominated to from your district, or how
well,
is it?
some are district nominations. There's an application process,
Right.
And we had for the 18-19, how many applications? 100 and over 200 applications to serve on the 18-19.
How do we get from that 200 down to the
Well,
members that serve?
there's a process. I mean, we begin to narrow them by the congressional districts because we want to make sure that we have equal representation from the congressional districts. We also look at the rating of the school, so we want to make sure that we have all performance classifications or grades of districts rated. We, certainly want to have a racial balance of the committee. We, because we've had a task force in place since 2012, this year staff was charged with going back and looking historically at the makeup of the former task force to ensure that the same districts, are not continuously represented, in the different areas of the state. So, because we get a lot of individuals that apply, each year and from the same districts, of course. And then we also work to ensure, I think we have 4 teachers, 4 principals, 4 superintendents. It's not a requirement, but we try to have the same number of practitioners, a balance of the practitioners.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yes, sir, just for 1 year. And then slide 13 is the current makeup of our technical advisory committee. I think you've recently seen some of these slides in some presentations. Slide 14 is the membership of the Commission on School Accreditation.
Asked for what's the process of these being selected on this? Is that driven by state statute?
So yes, sir. The Commission on School Accreditation membership is outlined in state statute. It represents the 5 congressional districts at the time that the law was passed. So we use a 1982 congressional district map for this assignment, and the commission consists of 15 members. 8 are witch practitioners and 7 lay people. And of the 8 practitioners, the law specifies that 2 must be current sitting superintendents, 2 must be school board members, 2 principals, and 2 teachers. And so the vacancy that we have, Mr. Tyner was a school board representative from Clarksdale, and he recently submitted his resignation. So we'll be making a recommendation hopefully soon to the state board to fulfill that position. And at this time,
sorry to ask so many questions, but
okay.
I'm hoping this is a learning session for the newer folks like me. The process you just laid out, is that how the process works? It goes to the accountability, then the technical, then the commission?
Yes, sir.
Is that
And then to the
1, 2,
state
3?
board. Yes, sir. The way the slides are ordered is the way we
process
have.
flow.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
But when we begin the work, and we certainly did not get to resolve all the issues that were concerns that were presented to the Accountability Task Force last year. We did have a number of recommendations for business rules that were presented to the state board and approved and were implemented for the 17-18 data that's before you for approval tomorrow. However, at the conclusion of the presentation, you'll see our next step slide. So there's a number of issues. One that we talk about a lot is the K-12 configuration. That was not resolved by the task force. So those issues will be carried over from the 17-18 task force to be addressed by the 18-19 task force.
But you bring up a really good point that I think is worth restating. By the time things come to you for your approval, they've already gone through the Accountability Task Force. And then once they come to an agreement, then all that same data goes to the Technical Advisory Committee. So now it goes to the national experts. They take a look at it. And if they too concur, then it moves on to the commission. And if the commission concurs, then it comes to the state board. So it goes through that whole process before it even comes to you.
So at this time, I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Oakley to share the impact of accountability.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As Chairman Tollison mentioned earlier, what gets measured gets done. And so as a state, we are receiving a lot of national attention because of the improvements we're seeing in outcomes for boys and girls across the state. You can see listed on your screen or in your packet on slide 16 a number of national organizations that are writing about the improvements that we're seeing in educational outcomes for students in Mississippi. From the National Association, National Assessment Governing Board that administers NAEP, the Foundation for Excellence that Dr. Hovanetz works with, to some early childhood groups and regional education laboratories, Southern Region Education Board that gets a lot of attention from particularly the southeastern part of the United States for their policy work, and then near another early childhood group. As we look at our early childhood, as our NAEP outcomes as a state, we've shared with you recently, in recent months, early childhood outcomes and the consistent improvement that we're seeing there from our collaboratives. But as we talk about NAEP outcomes, since 2009, from 2009 to 2017, Mississippi is number 3 in the nation with regard to 4th grade mathematics and 8th grade mathematics growth. So that's score gain by us as a state. We are number 3 in the nation. When we look at reading results, we are number 7 in the nation in 4th grade and number 9 in the nation for 8th grade. So again, this is improvement in reading as compared to other states across the country over the last 9 years. Our NAEP trends, you can see 4 individual charts here. At the top left is 4th grade math, top right is 8th grade math, bottom left 4th grade reading, and bottom right 8th grade reading. The interesting aspect to each of these, as you look at the light blue lines, that is the national public school outcomes from, again, 2007 to 2017, most recent administration. You can see those lines are generally flat, and you can see Mississippi's results underneath each of those. And so you can see that growth indicated. We're closing the gap with the nation in reading and mathematics. We believe a lot of this has to do with the concerted effort we've put into stronger, more rigorous academic standards and ongoing professional development, particularly in the areas of literacy and mathematics over the last 7 to 10 years. When we look at our state results, and these are map results you see on the screen, this is our students over 3 years, the same assessment, Mississippi Academic Assessment Program, 2016, 2017, and 2018 results in the green, blue, and yellow. On the left, this is students scoring proficient and advanced. We've seen 10% of our students bump from that level 1, 2, or 3 category into that proficient or advanced category over that 3-year time period. And then as we look at English language arts on the right, same time frame. This is composite, this is collective for us as a state. From 33.6% to 39.8% of our students have moved from a level 1, 2, or 3 into that level 4 or 5. We're almost 40% proficient in English language arts based on our most recent results. Graduation rate, we are as close as we have ever been as a state to hitting the national graduation rate, national average. We are trailing roughly 1% now, behind the national average based on our most recent results. From 2018, keep in mind that 2018 graduation rate data is lagged by a year. That's our spring 2017 graduates that we are looking at with that 83% calculation. That calculation, when it goes into the accountability model, does lag by 1 year. As we look at dual credit, again, as Senator Tollison said, the accountability model, as Mr. Burrow will look at with you shortly, rolls a lot of pieces into the calculation of grades for schools. Dual credit is one of those areas that's seen a lot of attention over the last few years as a state. We have more than doubled, and we're getting close to tripling based on our 2017-18 participation rates, the number of students that are participating in these dual credit courses wherein they can earn college credit as a high school student.
Quick sidebar question. What do you, in one answer, 10 seconds or less, what's the expansion? What would you say? Is it access? Is it marketing? Is it?
Also the fact that it's in an accountability model. It didn't used to be. And so this component gets counted in for acceleration, just like advanced placement, IB, Cambridge, all goes into the acceleration component. So once the model kicked in, When the model first started, it gave districts about a 3-year window to let you know, okay, in 3 years, this is now going to count. And so that really then, districts started opening up, to your point, access for kids so that they could earn points in the accountability model for acceleration, just as they did with AP, IB, and Cambridge.
I have a follow-up question, if you don't mind. The dual credit participation, perhaps I should know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask anyway. The dual credit participation and advanced courses, does a more affluent school district have any edge over the less affluent district when it comes to access to these kind of courses?
So with dual credit, I would say that the answer is yes, because unfortunately, we do not have a system where all children are being charged the same amount for courses. So you've got some districts that may only have to pay $50 a course, and then you've got other districts that may have to pay $450 a course. So if I'm living in a district of some significant poverty and the charge is $450, then the odds of me taking that are not as great as if I was in the district with $50. That being said, there are some districts that are helping students pay for these courses. There are some districts that are paying for the courses, and there are some districts whose parents are paying for the courses. So it's a whole mixture that's out there. You've also, and this is one thing that we're taking a look at now with IHL around the level of rigor of some of these courses, because one of the things that we want to make sure is that children, if they're earning college credit, are taking courses that are as rigorous as a college course should be. So some states, to your point also, legislatures have put a bucket of money, if you will, set aside for states, or excuse me, for districts and schools to draw down from upon successful completion. So they'll set aside $35, $40, $60 million in a bucket, and then if I'm in Gulfport and I take a course that's successful and I'm as successful at it instead of my parents paying for it, Gulfport could draw down from that money if that money existed to reimburse parents for that course. So that's one thing that we've been talking about and been talking about with the legislature, is being able to set aside some money, because not everybody's in a financial position to do that. Now, advanced placement's a little bit different, because advanced placement courses can be offered online, and many of them are. And so you've also got two districts that are side by side that are doing a pretty innovative thing. Boonville and Baldwin are two of your districts of innovation, and Boonville is offering all of its advanced placement courses to the children in Baldwin rather than having Baldwin do that. And Baldwin is offering all of its CTE program to Boonville. So it's a benefit for both districts, but a lot of these courses are online courses. So advanced placement you can get a lot easier online, dual credit not so much.
Is there anything that we can do as a board to mitigate some of these differences of what's being charged in some districts as opposed to other
I would
districts?
highly recommend that you take a stand when the legislature comes forward to craft that in legislation, because I don't think it's going to, I'll be honest with you, I don't think it's going to happen unless it's legislatively mandated. I don't see the community colleges changing their cost structure because of it.
Thank you.
I knew I was opening up something on that. Sorry. Every time we talk about it, I know Johnny's got a comment too, but I've said this from the beginning since I worked for Governor Barber. When we put the dual credit on the books, it's being paid for 3 times. Okay, it's a Carnegie unit and a 3-hour credit. The district gets paid for the MAEP, ADA. The full-time equivalent gets paid for at the community college level and the IHL level, and then the parent might have to pay some tuition. All 3 people, and the taxpayer, by the way, subsidizes the first 2, are paying 3 times for 1 credit. So, talk about, some inefficiencies in government. That is an absolute opportunity for us to say, look, let's pay for it 1 time.
So to your point, there should not be these discrepancies from one district to the next.
Correct. I mean, it should
Not be. That's exactly right, Dr. Keller.
I get it.
But just to be clear, the discrepancy lies within the community college or
Right.
wherever
Yes. Yes.
So
They're differentiating.
they're
how they pay.
differentiating how much they're charging for
Yes,
them.
that's exactly correct. There's not one common fee, and what some states
be.
have done is gone to a piece of legislation that just mandates a common fee, and then there's other states that have put aside a lot of money. for that.
I'll go ahead and bring this up now. This may be a little premature, and if you want me to hold it, I will. But equitable and fair across the board, what you just mentioned is one thing that's not equitable for all districts and their children and access. And when you put this in as a part of the model, now on dual enrollment, dual credit, a student has to make a C for that to get points in the model. And there are multiple ways they can get that. But when you've got districts that, because of the model, will say, okay, we're going to boost up our dual enrollment, dual credit, and you can do it by offering it yourself. Multiple ways you can offer dual enrollment, dual credit through the community colleges, et cetera. But then you got one district who a C is this, and another district a C is that, and you got some districts that regardless, every child gets a C because that gets points in the model. And then when the kid goes off to the community college or the university, and says, I got dual credit enrollment, what they're prepared to do is different from somebody else, So there's all sorts of ways to look at it,
I want to move on because I know we could drag down. Let me just ask, not by tomorrow, but at some point in the future, can you show us a breakdown of where the dual credit students are coming from? Why? I mean, it's awesome that it's
By district.
It's awesome that it's 2.5 times what it was 2-3 years ago. But if they're just in certain areas, that's probably not so awesome. So if we could just kind of see where the growth is over the last couple of years, I think that'll answer some of these questions. And respectfully, if you will just move on to slide 23, we'll get back on track. And I apologize to everybody for chasing that rabbit.
I didn't mean to slow you down.
And make a note, though, also that we need to talk about transferability, because that's another issue that's come up around dual credit and some of those dual credit courses not transferring. And so we're cleaning that up with the universities as well, but make a note of that, too.
And I would share the other piece that's worth noting here is that under ESSA Title IV funds do allow for support for students taking these advanced coursework options, dual credit, AP kinds of courses. So there is kind of an equity, a piece there that allows for some equity or equalizes opportunities. On the advanced placements side of things, you can see in the pink, that's the number of students that have tested. Test takers over the last 5 years. In green, the number of exams taken, and in blue, the number of exams that have received a score of 3 or higher. I would share that our 2018 data is embargoed until later this month. I believe AP College Board will be sharing that with Dr. Wright later this month, and so we'll have more information for you on that in the future. But you can see, again, a consistent upward trend in outcomes and participation in our advanced placement courses and exams. On the career technical side, again, when we look at our seniors or students who graduate or earn a GED who are also CTE program completers, you can see significant growth there since 2014-15. And just received today our most recent data from 17-18 puts our completer number at 8,594. So another jump of about 500-600 students since the prior year. This time I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Vanderford and Mr. Burrow.
Is it fair to say that again, another elementary question for me, I'm sorry, the student population, our state student population is this projection or trajectory the same, or has it been relatively flat?
Enrollment?
For which?
Yeah, enrollment.
Actually, our enrollment is dropping
Okay.
as a state.
But what we're seeing,
More impressive than, yeah, percentage-wise.
Right, it's not an
more
artifact
impressive.
of an increase.
Yeah.
in
That's
enrollment.
right, that's right. I just want to make
Question.
that clear.
Yeah, that's a good observation.
Okay.
So at this time, we'll shift our conversation to A through F grades in school accountability. And we have with us, as previously indicated, Dr. Christy Hovanich that will present a number of slides regarding this issue. So you also have this presentation in your blue folder.
Which you're going to now. Dr. Hovenich's presentation looks like this. It's in your packet.
And so since she had planned to be here prior to the hurricane, we're going to do our very best to follow her and project the slides or advance the slides through her presentation. So she may have to give us a cue if we're not advancing the slides in a timely manner.
Dr. Hovenichs, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Wright and members of the board. I truly appreciate the opportunity to present to you today, and I very much regret that I can't in person. We can start with slide 2, just to let you know who I am and who I work for. I'm with the Foundation for Excellence in Education. We're a 501 based out of Tallahassee, Florida. We do policy work, advocacy work, provide implementation assistance, and communication assistance. So we are more of a service nonprofit organization, and we're not either. I am a senior policy fellow for the organization. Prior to working for the foundation, I was an assistant commissioner in the state of Minnesota and served the state of Florida as a deputy, or assistant deputy commissioner from 99 to 2007. So have experience at the state level in multiple capacities, and also have the opportunity to work with the foundation for nearly the last 10 years. To go to the next slide, we really look at the purpose of accountability with two main functions. One, to define and measure what matters to students, first and foremost. And then secondly, to be able to really communicate those results to parents and the public so they can clearly and transparently and intuitively understand how well schools are doing. I have been privileged to be part of school accountability in Mississippi, very late 2001. Mississippi has made a substantial commitment to its students and families by setting high expectations and keeping themselves accountable for being there. They have definitely been a national leader, as Dr. Oakley just pointed out, in improving student outcomes. Dr. Wright holds the highest position for a state chief as the president of the board of directors for the Council of State School Officers, and Governor Bryant is the chair of the Education Commission of the state, which is an education policy research. These are policy positions for national education reformers really committed to outcomes. That says a lot about what Mississippi has done in the past 5 to 6 years. There's been an extraordinary commitment not just from the executive, but from the state board and the legislature. Senator Tolleson and Representative Moore's commitment, especially in the very early years, sitting through every single one of the TAC meetings, has been critical in the development of this. The department, as well as all the district participation, has made this the most transparent and inclusive process I've ever seen for developing an accountability system, its calculations, and its business rules. The fact that it goes through 4 different committees or commissions or task force, everything is public, everything's broadcast. It's been the most transparent system I've been involved in, and I've worked in more than half the states across the country in my last 10 years at the foundation. And Mississippi is not alone in school grading. They've done a fantastic job and are certainly seeing these results. So if you go to slide 4, you will see that there are currently 15 states employing an A-to-F school accountability system. It's the most commonly used rating system across the country. It is not a single system that's exactly the same employed in every state. But they have a lot of similarities and commonalities in these systems. On slide 5, you will see some of our results and impact nationally for school grades. Student outcomes, academic research, and also public opinion support using A-to-F school grades. Based on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, states that have had A-to-F intact for multiple NAEP administrations. 8 of 10 of them have improved their 4th grade reading scores more substantially than the national public. There have been several academic research studies done that demonstrate A through F has had a significant impact over states not rating A through F, and that A through F has actually changed educator behaviors and outcomes in the classroom. We've also done a bunch of polling. This is a national poll we've done, but we've also done state level polls. An overwhelming majority of the public support A through F school grading in the state. On slide 6, we have learned a lot over the last almost 20 years of implementing A through F in Florida, as well as all the other states that we've been working with in the last 10 years. And we've come to the same conclusion, and we've been saying this for a while, is what gets measured gets done. And there are 9 fundamental principles that we have found that are the ones that lead to the most success successful outcomes for schools. Mississippi's system employs 7 of these fundamental principles and has been doing a great job in implementing a successful school grading system. The first one is just simply using clear and transparent descriptors so people understand them, which are A through F, to really focus on objective and concise student learning outcomes, which is also done in their system. They balance student growth and performance, so there's not only looking at whether or not students are improving and not only looking at whether or not they're proficient, so it creates a more level playing field and still holds all students to high expectations. And very importantly, they calculate growth towards grade level achievement or advanced achievement. So they're looking at whether or not students are making progress towards achieving Mississippi standards, not whether or not they're just doing better than their peers are. So really setting that high expectation that students are eventually going to reach proficiency if schools are getting annual credit for them making growth. They also focus on the lowest performing students. This is really important. There are students in all subgroups and categories of students that are low performing, and looking at the lowest performing students in each of these components levels the playing field across all schools and ensures that we're really focusing on the students that actually need help, not just arbitrarily based on subgroups. Their reporting system is fantastic too, with respect to reporting the information out by student subgroup, but really focusing in on the lowest 25% within the rating is a key feature. One of the things that Mississippi hasn't been stellar on is the timely reporting of results. And this is an artifact of changing assessments multiple times as a result of having to do standard setting over the summer and not getting those results out in before school starts so parents can make informed decisions, teachers have time to remediate and do professional development, so schools have and districts have an opportunity to reorganize resources or staffing or personnel however they see fit. So we really encourage states to get school grades out prior to the start of the school year in order to make sure that those decisions can be made with the most recent information. And Mississippi, for number 7, is working right now very actively on creating a new school report card. They'll have 8 of 9 principals as soon as they release their new report, and show how to clearly communicate with parents. The navigation of the website's a little tricky now to get that information very clearly. They also establish rigorous criteria for earning an A through F, as well as automatic increases. These automatic increases we find are incredibly instrumental in ensuring you're continuing to rise the tide and expecting more from students. Very difficult to raise expectations, whether it's student proficiency expectations or expectations for earning an A or an F, and having this preset determination that as soon as 65% of schools earn a B, that the following year the increase is going to go into place, give schools and educators advance notice what's going to happen, and then also automatically raises that expectation so you don't stagnate. And then Principle 9 is using this information for recognizing schools that are doing a great job, but also giving supports and interventions to those schools that are struggling. So overall, Mississippi has a system that is definitely one of the national leading systems and definitely something to be proud of. I can't overemphasize enough the importance of student outcome results. The reason we do school accountability is to improve outcomes for students. And so I typically look at NAEP results because there's been so much changeover in state assessment systems and because graduation requirements are different from state to state. Whenever I report on impact or results, I always use the national NAEP data because it's the only longitudinal comparison we have from state to state. And so this is the time I'll brag a little bit on Mississippi. I think they've done a fantastic job again. 4th graders rank 2nd in the nation in improvements on 4th grade reading and 4th grade math from the baseline of before implementing HRF to today. 2nd in the nation. That's impressive. Mississippi 4th graders that are free and reduced price lunch rank 5th in the nation for 4th grade math and 3rd in the nation for 4th grade reading from prior to implementing HRF to today. They've halved the gap to the national average over that same amount of time. And the state average the state average is closest to the national average than they have been ever since they started NAEP testing. So the progress made on this national assessment, that's the long-standing kind of gold standard for student improvement, is remarkable. I can continue to break down Mississippi's achievement results. I won't read through them. You can read through them on your own. One of the things I do have on here is on slide 9. We're looking at closing the gap. You'll do see that Mississippi has had improvement, but it's kind of tracked the national improvement until implementation of A through F and also your K-3 reading policy. Then you had a huge increase, and you have closed the gap to the national average, closer than you've ever been to the national average in 4th grade reading since NAEP started testing. 8th grade reading scores, again, those are starting to catch up with your 3rd grade reading policy, K-3 reading policy in place. You're going to start seeing better results even in 8th grade. Now that's been in place for a few years. The 19 NAEP results probably should look pretty good. You can see that when the national average went down, Mississippi went down, but not as much. And when the national average went up, Mississippi went up much more than the national average. So not only are they following their trends, they're following the trends not as severely. So you can see a lot more improvement there. Math 4th grade, only 4 points different from the national average. Also very impressive on slide 11. Closest they've ever been to the national average, more than halved the gap from the national average from prior to implementing A through F. And then on slide 12, also closer to the national average than they have been. The trends for 8th grade math had a dip. Mississippi stayed level. Doesn't seem like improvement, but when you're looking at the national trend, it is a definite improvement for the states. They didn't follow the national trend. They actually held steady. Slide 13 gives perspective. Dr. Oakley kind of mentioned some of these, but I put them in one table just to kind of highlight. Mississippi's in the top quarter of every single improvement rating pretty much across the board. We look at not just all students in that first column on the top, where you see they're second only to DC for improving in 4th grade reading since prior to implementing A through F, 10th in improvement since last year. First in improvement from last year for all students in 8th grade reading. Free and reduced price lunch students are also benefiting substantially too. Not just your high performing, economically advantaged students that are doing great. Students that are receiving free and reduced price lunch are also making pretty significant improvements in achievement on the National Assessment for Educational Progress. So just some very exciting numbers in Mississippi. When thinking through this, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the presentation, but it was really important to the state that you had one single accountability system. So you weren't running dual accountability systems, one for the state and one for the U.S. Department of Education. States had done that in the past. It's very confusing. It's very difficult to do. And so really focusing in on what are the requirements of the new federal law, and what things were already in place in Mississippi, there really wasn't much Mississippi had to change in their accountability system to transition to those new requirements. So every state had to set goals and targets for achievement and graduation and English learners. They did that. They all had to identify which indicators would be included in school accountability to meaningfully differentiate these schools on an annual basis. And there had to be at least 4 different things that were included. Academic achievement, another academic indicator. So for elementary schools, it could be anything that you wanted to, but most states chose growth. So I think 49 of the 51 jurisdictions are using some type of growth. And then for high schools, it had to be the graduation rate. And the graduation rate had to be based on the 4-year rate. And if at the state's discretion they wanted to include an extended rate, they could. Some states chose to include an extended rate, but it had to be based on the 4-year cohort graduation rate as the indicator. One that got a lot of attention, there was no state in the nation that included an indicator on the progress of English learners learning the language English. So every single state in the country had to include an indicator in their school accountability system that looked at the progress of English learners on their English language acquisition skills. This was brand new. It was very difficult to do. There was no statewide data for any state really to use to be able to develop and include these indicators with respect to impact. And it was one of the things that did challenge just about every state that we worked in how to include this, where to include this, and frankly, a lot of the questions we got is, why? And so Congress just decided that English learners were a priority this year over all other subgroups, over students with disabilities, over economically disadvantaged, over everything else, and said, states, you're including English language acquisition in your accountability indicators. So they did. And then they also had to include an indicator of school quality or student success. This is a pretty easy one for most states, including science, social studies tests, any kind of college and career ready measures. Most states already had these in place, so that was fairly easy to do. The thing that really tripped up was the EL indicator for most states. From this, we also had to identify schools for comprehensive and targeted support. This definitely fell more to the state's discretion on how to do that and then what to do with those schools once they were identified. So slide 15 just shows the things that didn't have to change in the accountability system compared to the things that did have to change. So the things that had to change were the inclusion of the EL indicator, the identification, the way schools were actually identified moving forward, and then it was the district and state responsibility to determine the intervention. So the first one, most states weren't too excited about. The second and third indicators, the criteria for identifying schools for interventions, and then the state and district responsibility to determine the supports and interventions were actually really good things that most states embraced, because they now were not being told you have to identify these particular schools and then offer these 6 different interventions in this particular order. So those last two are definitely things that were helpful to the states. The first one, didn't hear too many states excited about the first one. On the balance, so there were a lot of things that didn't have to change. I mean, you didn't have to change growth, proficiency, didn't have to change your student outcomes that were in there, you didn't have to change your ratings, you didn't have to change the focus on the lowest 25% or how you calculated college and career ready measures. Your grading scale is there, you already had a 95% testing requirement. So there are a lot of things that didn't actually have to change in your system, and really just one major thing that did. And I say that, and then if you look at slide 16, I was in Florida from 99 to 2007 during both of Governor Bush's administrations, working either in the governor's office or at the State Department. And that's when we first released our school letter grades and the progress that you'll see here. And the reason I include this chart is just to show you that each of those dotted lines with the arrow on it indicates the time that we had to change our school grading system. And every single time we did, we raised the rigor on the expectations of what we had for students and our educators in the state of Florida. And you can see that just about every time we raised expectations, we had a drop off in A and B schools and an increase in DNF schools. So the A and B school line is the green one on top, the DNF is the blue one on the bottom. And a lot of times these changes were necessary, and a lot of times these changes were things that schools weren't excited about, but once we included them, they really changed how educators focused on their practice. So particularly, as Dr. Oakley was showing, the dual enrollment and advanced placement, test takers, test taken, and then test passers, we saw those same kind of results in Florida, and we've been doing it for 20 years, so our magnitude is astronomical. To keep the track and keep the pace on this, you're going to see those numbers continue to rise. We haven't seen any stagnation in the number of test takers and the number of test passers. We haven't seen any stagnation in dual enrollment. We continue to see more and more kids take advantage of these opportunities. And we also continue to raise the expectations on what proficiency means in the state of Florida. And so you may know I've bragged on Mississippi a whole lot about NAEP results. Florida did even better than Mississippi on NAEP results. And they continue to show and demonstrate that they're improving outcomes using just about the same system Mississippi has in place for A through S. And if Florida can do it with 2.8 million kids, I'm certain Mississippi can keep pace and keep doing it with what we have in place already. So slide 17 just shows some anecdotal things we see from the impact of A through S school grading. It increases transparency. I mean, you're probably having so many more conversations about school accountability than you've ever cared to have about school accountability. And you're getting into the weeds of it. You're getting into the calculation and the detail because people know about it now and they're talking about it. and they're not just vague labels or something that isn't interpretable to the general public. It also really did lead to improved student improvement. I mean, we looked at across the board from Dr. Oakley's presentation and from NAEP results that there's a lot of improvements, not just for economically advantaged, able-bodied students. It's across the board improvement and starting to close those achievement gaps. You also have probably seen a lot of increased parent involvement, and we have across the country as well. People are looking at these grades. They want to know, they want to have the information. They want to be able to make decisions about where their kid's going to school based on information that you're providing. And there's also more of a command focus on learning. Urban did a study that really showed how educators changed their practice. But also we have anecdotal information from attending school board meetings in different counties in Florida where they're not dedicating their meetings anymore to bus schedules and lunches and extracurriculars, but really focusing on how do we improve curriculum, how do we improve instruction, do we have the right teachers in the right classes in the right buildings, what can we do so we don't have any C school in our district anymore? And it really changes the conversation about what's happening in the schools and districts. And then slide 18, I just like to leave as a reminder that accountability itself isn't what improves student outcomes. It's the data that's used from these sort of school grades really inspires action by educators and policymakers that will start to improve those student outcomes. That's it.
Well, Christy, thank you so much. And to your comment about communicating with parents, wait till you see our new interactive report card that's going to go live and how parent-friendly and user-friendly it is. So we welcome your feedback on that because it should go live tomorrow.
Can we ask one question?
We've got questions for you, so if you can hear us, it sounds like you can, Dr. Kelly.
Yep.
I want to go 2 slides back. It's my slide number 8. It speaks to the changes that you made in your system, in the rating system, and injecting rigor each time you made the change. We see the results. Looking at the graph, it's very clear that every time you made a change, when you interjected the rigor, the outcomes was for the better. My question to you is, how painful was it making the changes? What kind of response did you get from districts? I wanted an honest answer about how much pushback did you get from districts, if any?
So I appreciate your question. You'll get nothing but honesty from me because I was there in 1999 when we released school grades with more DNS schools than we did A or B schools. It was extraordinarily unpleasant. But at that time, Florida was in the bottom 10 on every single measure you can imagine. Bottom 10 on NAEP, bottom 10 on graduation. Our graduation rates were actually decreasing at that time when Governor Bush took office. Our dropout rates were increasing at that time, and it was awful. But we put into place this very rigorous system because we knew we had to do something that was changing. Florida's population was continuing to grow and expand, and it's extraordinarily diverse. And if we didn't have high expectations for students, we were going to be in this never-ending downward spiral. So we put into place the grading system that we did, and I'll tell you, the only thing that we changed was we used to grade schools with Roman numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, put into place by the previous governor. We changed that to an A through F school grading system, and those were the results. After the first year, we had more A and B schools than we did DNS. After the second year, we had twice as many A and B schools as we did the first year we implemented it. We didn't change a single thing with respect to standards, rigor, expectation, how many points it took to earn an A in those first 3 years of the system. We put the system in place and we held it there. That was all educators. As soon as they knew what we were measuring and what we expected of them and what we expected of kids, we had a complete reversal. And granted, 40-some% of schools being an A or a B isn't that many, but it really incited educators to focus on what was important. In 2002, we were able to include individual student learning gains. And so in 99 through 2001, all we had were testing in 4, 8, and 10 in reading and 5, 8, and 10 in math. And so we couldn't do student learning gains. But when we put the system in place in 99, we also started building out our statewide assessment. And keep in mind, this was all before NCIB, so we couldn't even say the feds are making us do this. This was just our own thing of saying, this is what we're doing, and we're committed to doing this. And it took a lot of leadership from our executive and from our legislature and from what we previously had as an appointed state or elected state board, now an appointed state board by the governor rather than just the cabinet, an elected chief, now an appointed chief. But it took all of those people to really get together and say, this is important that we do this. It is important that we turn our state around. We're never going to be an economically, we don't have a quality education system and workers to go into and help, you know, raise the expectations of our workforce and have companies move here. And so including learning gains really helped us level the playing field. And that's, I think, the one exception where we thought we were raising the rigor by requiring that all students make improvements in outcomes. But this is where we learned kind of the hard way that proficiency isn't the best way to measure, proficiency alone isn't the best way to measure a school's effectiveness. You had to look at whether or not schools were improving, and we found a lot of low-performing schools that made huge jumps in student expectations, huge jumps in progress from year to year. So that was probably the least painful rigor, that what we thought would be a rigorous implementation, that wasn't. We also added, this was one of Florida's dirty little secrets, which we had to change with No Child Left Behind, is we didn't include students with disabilities and English learners in our system. I mean, yeah. So, and that never came out until we had to submit for No Child Left Behind. We had to include all students, and we were including all students now for AYP. We had to obviously include all students now for A through F. So yeah, we included all students now, which was a pretty big deal. But you'll notice including all students didn't really change that much. I mean, it went down a little bit for A's and B's, and it went up a little bit for D's and F's, but it wasn't a huge swing. And we have a whole lot of English learners in the state of Florida. We also added science and math for the lowest performing students. We started giving a science exam. We thought science was important. We wanted to add that, but we also wanted to maintain the balance of growth and proficiency. So we added the low 25% for math and added the science component to maintain that. Had a little bit of an impact, but again, kind of bounced back right away. In 2010, we added all those high school components. We never used to look at high school graduation rate. We didn't look at at-risk students. We didn't look at acceleration or college readiness. And now we started doing that for high schools. We started focusing on what's really important for high schools. It's not just whether or not they're making growth, because by the time you get to high school, growth just doesn't cut it anymore. You have to be ready to exit that K-12 system. So we were looking at more readiness measures and whether or not you are actually meeting those expectations, not just almost getting to those expectations. Some of the harder ones that we did, and you've experienced this too now, is we, prior to adopting the standards formerly known as the Common Core, we adopted the Florida Sunshine State Next Generation Standards. And so we adopted those standards in anticipation of reauthorization, and also put in place a new test. And so we went from 75 to 80% of kids proficient on our test to like 60 or 50%. And this was before everyone else was doing it, 3 years before everyone else was doing it. So that was a pretty horrific blow. At least with 14, 15, when everyone else was doing it, it wasn't as big of a deal. But there wasn't such thing as an honesty gap back then, and we were the only state doing it, which made it really hard. And then we also did it again in 2015 with everyone else, because we used 2012 as a stepping stone to get us partway there, because we knew we were so far away. Did it again in 2015, also extraordinarily difficult to do. We had an automatic increase for our grading scale. We got to implement that automatic increase for our grading scale on how difficult or how many points you needed to earn an A. So that also impacted how things went. And then one of the things we found, and this is what I always caution students on, is after so many years of having your system, 12, 13, 14 years, we got to a point where we had so many caveats and business rules and if-thens, and we just really needed to get back to basics with our calculation. We had too many things that were just kind of thrown in and added on because of a special interest or a special case, and we were trying to write an accountability system that captured every exception rather than captured what was important for student outcomes. And so in 2015, we went back to basics. We cut out all those extraneous business rules. We cut out all the if-thens and really went just right back to basics with our new statewide assessment, the Florida Standards Assessment, and went back to focusing on reading, math, science, and social studies proficiency, growth, graduation, college and career ready indicators. That was it. And then in 2016, we made it harder to earn growth points. So not only now did you have to make improvements in your in growth, you had to improve, if you were already proficient, you had to improve your relative standing within the proficient category. So if you were at high proficient, the next year, if you moved to low proficient, you wouldn't have made growth. You had to improve to a higher proficient within that category by at least 1 point higher in your relative position than you were before. And so we really raised the rigor on what it meant to make growth. So now we have growth expectations that don't just allow you to pass or maintain a proficient level. You have to actually advance in your expectation through there. So I'll tell you, after almost 20 years, I still get to stand before the Florida State Board of Education and tell them why it's important that they maintain rigor, why they increase expectations, and why age-direct grading is still important. And the results that have come out of Florida, because they've maintained the system, have been phenomenal. And so it's hard, it's tough love. The thing with Florida is we didn't have any bottom-up involvement. This was all a top-down initiative. And, you know, with Mississippi, you have educators that are participating in this process. You have 4 committees that this goes through before it even hits, you know, reality. And so I think that makes your process a little bit easier. Some of the things we did were a lot more painful because it was just, we're doing this, the legislature put it in the law, that was it. Like, there was no vetting, there was no buy-in. I mean, the executive frequently had Big 7 meetings for our biggest 7 districts in Florida. You know, your Miami, Palm Beach, Pinellas, Orange, Duval, Dade. Got everybody together and talked to the Big 7, but that was about it. And so I think your process should be a little bit less painful because everybody already knows what's going to happen. They might not like it, but the other thing that I tell everybody, and I'm going to do this in another state right now, is even if you acquiesce to every single recommendation, suggestion, decision by every single policymaker, staffer, district level person, and put those hours there because you think you're appeasing everybody, still not anybody's going to come to you and say, I love your accountability system. So it just, you're never going to get to a winning situation with people that are being held accountable by the system.
Once again, we're very grateful for that insight. I think it's always informative for everyone to certainly see how other states are doing it. Lessons learned. Obviously, you guys have been at this a lot longer than the state of Mississippi. So with that, I think we're about to get in to the next part of this, which is the actual, okay, I'm going to turn over to Mr. Suggs in a second. We're going to get into the actual Mississippi accountability part of this, where I think we've got some very specific questions. And so after Mr. Suggs asks this question, we're going to do a 5-minute biotechnology break, and then we'll convene back here and get back into it. And we're about halfway through with the time that we have. Yes, sir. Just very quickly, to kind of piggyback on the original question. So in the state of Florida, do you have a requirement that you A schools or B schools must be at a statewide 65% or something before you change the standard or make a recommendation to change the standard?
No, we do not. So we change our school grading system based on changes in federal law, based on recommendations from the legislature, but not the only thing that was changed based on the 65% was the actual grading scale, and that's only been invoked one time.
Thank you.
Okay, let's take that break and reconvene at 3:25.
At 60, Sean, to your point, I think that's
26, so 1 minute behind schedule. But I think this next part,
Thank you.
everybody can grab their seats. I think this next part of the review will really be informative. We've got this broad foundational view, kind of an overview in the history of where we are, but I think this next hour and a half will be really focused on the Mississippi specific accountability model and specifically how we develop the model. So with that, Nathan or Paul, I'll just turn it over to you guys and you can take it from here.
Right, at this point, we are on slide 25, or actually slide 26 of the presentation, and Alan Vera, who is the Director of Accountability, will provide you an overview of the components of our system.
Hey, I'm the Director of District and School Performance
Under
the Office of Accountability, but that's okay.
Commonly referred to as Alan. Yeah.
That's fine. So we've thus far looked at the history of the Mississippi Accountability System, how we got to where we are, what other states are doing relative to what we're doing, kind of how we stand nationally. And I'll speak to the accountability system that's in place and some more details about it and provide any answers to any questions you might have. So the first slide that I have is one that Dr. Hovnitz went over. It's federal requirements. I wanted to start with, how did we formulate what is included in our accountability system? Mississippi was at an advantage from other states when ESSA came along. We had a lot of components that were already set up and in place that met the requirements under ESSA. In working with other states, it appears as though Mississippi was about 2 to 3 years at least ahead of other states in the development of their accountability systems in regard to ESSA requirements. So the state was in a good place there. As we have mentioned before, there's several different ways to measure student performance or have performance measures for schools and districts. In Mississippi, we look at primarily proficiency and growth. So both proficiency and growth can, a school can show a good performance or increase in performance through proficiency and or growth. We also look at participation rates for states. Of course, there's federal requirements for 95% participation. Mississippi has an additional requirement that if a school does not have a 95% participation rate, that they're dropped a letter grade, which is a pretty big hit. So most of our schools make sure that they have meet that 95% participation requirement. Then, of course, graduation rates are weighted heavily within our model. 200 points for districts and schools with 12th grade go towards graduation rates. And then we have other indicators such as our college and career readiness component, which is in Mississippi is the ACT. It's whether or not a student meets the benchmarks in the ACT. And then we have credit for accelerated courses, so our acceleration component, which includes the dual credit CTE AP courses. So these are the assessments that Mississippi uses in order to measure proficiency and growth. We have our math assessment for reading, language arts, and mathematics that is measured in grades 3 through 8. And then we have end-of-course assessments in high school. We have English 2 for the ELA requirement and Algebra 1 for the math requirement. And then we also have the alternate assessment program for students that meet those requirements. Proficiency is measured in grades 5th and 8th grade in science, biology 1 in high school, and U.S. history. We do not measure growth on those assessments. I also note that U.S. history is the only assessment in this lineup that is not a federal requirement. So when I talk about growth, I'm talking about how does a student perform from one year to the next, or how does a student progress from one year to the next. So there's many different ways of measuring growth. In Mississippi, we use like an indexing system where we have a set of expectations for our different performance levels and movement across those performance levels. So you'll see here in this slide, it shows the 5 performance levels that make up MAP, and then there are 8 growth levels. So we have split the lower 3 proficiency levels in half, and we do that in order to show smaller increments of growth and award points for smaller increments of growth. So you can grow a student within a performance level and still get credit for growth. And then all of these arrows that I have on here are just showing different growth opportunities and how a student may move across these growth levels. So a student can earn a point from going from proficiency level 1 to proficiency level 2. That would be a normal expectation, but again, as I said, we are measuring smaller increments of growth, so a student can also earn growth for going from a 1A to a 1B. We award additional weighting for students that cross over a proficiency level. We would call this a student who exceeds the expectation for growth from one year to the next. So a student may go from level 1 to level 3, then they get 1.25 in the calculation of growth. This is simply a numerator over denominator measurement. So our 1.25 goes in our numerator. And then we have additional weighting for students who go from any performance level below advanced to advanced. So a student that goes from a 3 to a 5 or 4 to a 5, they also get that additional weighting, the 1.25. And then we, as you may recall, we made a couple of changes this year. One was to change the exceeds growth expectation from a 1.2 to a 1.25. The other change that we made was in regards to a student who is advanced and stays advanced from one year to the next. Previously that did not get the additional weighting, so now we have the 1.25 for a student who is advanced and stays advanced from one year to the next. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think it's probably better, and I would recommend this if y'all have questions as we move along, so we don't run out of time towards the end. I know about in the model, the lower 25 showing proficiency and growth, and that counts. We see that's separate than the going from the midpoint, which is also in the accountability model, but it's only for moving from the midpoint from 1A to 1B. And 2, is it also for 2A to 2B?
2A to 2B, 3A to 3B.
Yes.
So you get credit for the bottom 3 when you move across the midpoint within the score.
Right. Yeah.
But one of those little nuanced complexities, even though you don't move a grade, if you move past the midpoint, you get credit for growth for the 3, not just the 2.
That's correct.
On
yes.
up too, right?
Yeah, so it can be a 1A to a 1B or 2A to 2B or a 2B to 3A.
4 and 5, we don't do a midpoint between 4A and 4B or 5A and 5B.
No, and once you're proficient, you get credit for growth. So there's been some statements about, students that are performing at proficiency, at proficient or advanced, it's hard to get additional growth measures for high-performing schools, for example, but we award growth points for a student who maintains proficient from one year to the next. So they're not necessarily growing, but they're counted and included in the growth measurement, as long as they're proficient.
Is the balance between achievement and growth gotten out of kilter? Are we more heavily weighting growth than we are achievement or proficiency? You got 8 levels of growth and 5 of proficiency.
Well, so what we're trying to do, or what I see is occurring here, is that we get credit for proficiency and or growth. So you can have a school that has a high level of proficiency but not as much growth, and they will be rated as a higher grade level. Or you can have a school that has a high level of growth but not necessarily as much proficiency and still have the higher achievement levels. And we'll look at a couple of examples of schools and their actual scores and the components shortly.
But there's a balance between growth and proficiency then?
Well, there's an opportunity, yes, there's a good balance of opportunity to grow or to show proficiency.
Potential, but actual outcomes.
Address is like
That's some examples, and a couple more slides you'll answer your question.
Okay, so I want to just talk a little bit about how we go through standard setting and how do we establish what is an A, a B, C, D, and F, and then also touch on setting a baseline. So I want to start first with standard setting because there's a difference between standard setting and setting a baseline. Standard setting is the process in which we go through to establish what is a norm, what is a descriptor of a school or district that should earn an A versus what is the descriptor for a school or district should earn an F. And I want to talk about the process that we went through to do that. So these are the expectations. This was standard setting for the current accountability system was done whenever we first had our first year of MAP results, because we now had a new assessment. We had new proficiency expectations and growth expectations. And the standard setting was done in 2016. It was a process that was done through, it started with the Accountability Task Force. And we had a group of, the Accountability Task Force that got together and looked at these performance level descriptors. So establishing what is a descriptor for an A school or district, looking at the results, the actual observed results for that year, which would have been 2016, would have been MAP results, and then identifying what would be your lowest performing school that you'd be willing to give an A, for example. What would be the lowest performing school that you would be willing to deem a B, a C, a D, an F, so on. And then we tie that over to the percentile rank for that school and district. So we're looking at observed data in 2016, and I'll start with A. We look at A, what is the lowest a school could perform, meet these descriptors, and still be and be considered an A. And whatever that percentile is what we assign to that grade label. So for an A, we settled with board approval at 90th percentile. For the B, it was the 63rd, C 38th, and the F was the 14th percentile.
Alan, can you meet those descriptors and not fall within that grade band?
So these descriptors are not set in stone. This is the reason why we have to have a group of people to look at the results and consider these descriptors. It is not completely objective. So when we're looking at the results, we're looking at, in general, does this school meet the performance descriptor? So to answer your question, yes, I mean, you can have, based on these performance level descriptors, you may perform better in proficiency and less in growth and meet the descriptor in one area but not the other. So it is a matter of judgment, and it is a matter of, like I said, getting a lot of heads in the game to look at the data and to see, based on the group, what is the agreement.
That would be one of the arguments out there, that I met that descriptor, but I didn't fall in the A category. Again,
another balance question here. We are heavily weighted, more heavily weighted on the lower 25 than we are anything else on it. You got the lower 25 in each one of these 5 categories.
Once you see the components, the lower 25% counts in both reading and in math, but it's not weighted any more than proficiency in reading and in math. It's just additional component. We've got more slides coming, I think, that are going to explain your question. I think, Mr. Bailey, to your point, I think it's important to note that this was a group of practitioners that got together across the board to come up with these descriptors, and that's what they were asked. If you were thinking about an A school, what would that A school or district look like to you? So it was really their opinions of the people that were in the room that then landed on these descriptors. So to Alan's point, they're not hard and fast. They're a general description of what you would think an A school, a B school, etc. would be. That,
to my point, it is a generalization.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Some people take that literally and looking at it and say, look, I met this standard, I'm not there. So, more clarity.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and it is a matter of then establishing, and this slide shows this distribution that includes all grade assignments. We're not looking to say everybody's an A. Somebody's got to be an F, and it's a matter of looking at that distribution and saying what schools are we willing to say are an F. which ones are the lowest performing in the group.
But let me push back a little bit on that.
Okay.
Because, you know, not everybody's got to be an F and not everybody's got to be an A. It depends on your performance. So if I'm an F district and I've got a handful of F districts, they too can become Ds, or they too could become Cs, and they too could become Bs, and they too could become As.
Well,
it's not once an F, always an F, once a C, always a C.
No,
so,
absolutely.
yeah, this is the distribution, but you're going to see another slide that shows that these distributions, we're going to solve a misnomer that's out there too about you can only ever have 10% of your schools or districts as A's, which is not true either. That's the reason I needed to stop you on that one point.
Have to have F schools.
That's exactly correct.
That to be made clear.
That's exactly correct.
But every time you reset cut scores and go back to this, if you look in reality, we wind up with 10% A, F's, et cetera, and so forth, right?
When you
Right.
reset
So
cuts.
that way we're forcing folks into this bell curve type thing every time we do cut scores and go back and use this.
That was your board policy. Right. When you reset cuts, that's correct.
Absolutely. Yeah. And go ahead.
But I guess my question is, when you distribute them like that, some of the feedback that I get, and I wonder about too. So let's say your points come back and you have the exact same point value you had the previous year, and you were a B. But the way that they get laid out, there's enough schools that get above that push you down to a C. Is that true? Is that how that works?
That can happen.
Yes. Have the same score from the previous year and go from a B to a C.
You'll grow. You can show an improvement in your score and still drop it a little bit.
And one of the things that comes up in comments, of course, is the competition between schools not to want to help each other. If you're going to go at the 90th percentile and draw a line, then somebody's going to be knocked out, somebody's going to be in. So the willingness to share information and to increase our craft could be impeded if in fact it is that way. And so you got that 90th percentile, you got and you're just drawing it at that 90th percentile, then you got a situation where you may have, and it happened this year, in that you may have 4 that move in and out of that category based on where you drew the line. You know, 4 more moved above you and 4 more, so you're really competing against each other in this thing rather than helping each other. So that's one of the I guess unintended consequences of this model that pits districts against each other versus wanting them to help each other along the way.
Got that same rigor. I'm still pushing as hard as I did the year before, and I still showed that my kids are performing at level or above, but it's not enough to keep me where I was. I get dropped down. Does that make sense? What I'm saying, I feel like there's a sense too, even when it comes back to the teacher level, of what else do I need to add? What else can I do? Because I'm hitting these points and my kids are showing it, but I'm coming down. My grade's coming down.
Well, we don't calculate that at the classroom level, just so you know. It's just calculated at the elementary, or at the school level and the district level. Yeah.
Right. But I guess what I'm saying, when it gets broken down to the teachers and to the grade level where they're performing, that's where our minds go. Okay, as a grade level that's impacting, what else do we need to do differently? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
There's a lot of factors that are going into the data that influence how the distribution lands. You know, we're talking about that sort of thing. And if we look at the high school results, for example, this year, we saw that high schools saw a big reduction in growth. Was that because students were not growing at the high schools, or was it something else? And we know it was something else. It was because we were not comparing the same assessment in one year to the next. And so reestablishing the cuts for high schools this year was done in order to more accurately reflect student performance, which we knew was going up. But if we left it the way it was, high schools were going to show as though they dropped in performance. So we're not just resetting a baseline to force this distribution again necessarily, but it's also to make sure that the results that come out are an accurate reflection of student performance. Had we not reestablished the distribution for high schools this year, you would have seen everybody grouped down at the bottom.
Time we will ever deviate from that percentage up there that we're forcing this bell curve is when we keep our cut scores the same in years out. Then you can have 100 A's and et cetera.
That's right.
And we haven't done that since we instituted it, correct?
So I'm going to show that.
Cut scores every year.
I'm going to show that in the next slides. So we'll step through that.
One thing.
Okay, sure.
Florida had 58% based on their slide previously, 58% A's and B's in their distribution. So just a note that, you know, we're going back to the 10% and those percentiles. We're kind of looking at those guys. Obviously, were able to progress that, you know, into those levels. Now I don't know whether it was based on every time we reset cut scores, or I'm sure they got to a percentage. I think that question was asked. When you get to a certain percentage of A's, do you increase that? And so I get that part of it. But just to note that they were 58% A's and B's.
You know, and I think we would also, this would be a factual statement to say that we want to see that distribution of A's and B's increase. We want to see the results be reflective of the performance gains that we're seeing across the state. So
if we want to see it increase, how are we going to do that with what we have?
So
if we have to reset cut scores.
Right. So that's what I want to talk to next. Setting the baseline.
Let me, since you mentioned this, you said they didn't change anything in the first 3 years.
But we've had extenuating circumstances.
I mean, we've changed the accountability. I mean, there's rationale.
And we're going to have to
that.
change it
And 3
next
different
year, so you
assessments.
might as well gear up.
And
Nothing.
3.
Let's let Alan go
I was
through
gonna
his
say,
examples he has
yeah.
prepared,
came
and then
here
we'll
to
argue
discuss.
about it.
We are. Go on, Alan. Go ahead.
All right. So, so we talked about doing standard setting, and you know, when I talk about forcing a distribution and making sure that we have all grade labels covered, I'm talking about setting a baseline. The standard setting, the first year that we're looking at data. It's not our intent to redo this every year. It's to establish a baseline now that is reflective of the current measures of performance and can be used as a gauge in future years. So there's several. I mean, if I tell you, for example, that it's 75 degrees outside in Fahrenheit, if you don't know that 32 degrees is freezing and 212 degrees is boiling, then what does that mean to you? So it's the same thing that we're doing here. We're establishing a reference year. We're saying these if my district has proficiency rates and growth rates that look like this, what does that mean? And am I improving from one year to the next? But if we don't hold those measures of performance the same from year to year, then we can't look back and see, are we progressing, or are we better from last year, looking at the accountability results. So we're establishing a baseline, a reference year, and we're going to be able to predict future performance based on those indicators and the values of those indicators in future years. For example, I would expect for proficiency rates to increase, and if I look at my reference year, then I know where to start. I know where I'm looking for. Yes, sir.
Your neighbor. Y'all remember a thing that we sat in here and spent a lot of time on called bridge scores? What was that about?
Next slide. Next slide.
So, in our first baseline year,
I'm not staying ahead of you.
Because you won't be quiet and listen.
We're going to run out of time, but you're at 8 o'clock. Let's roll.
So 2016, we did our standard setting, and we established a baseline year, and we were measuring growth using a bridge scale. And the bridge scale's intent was to equate the assessment results from MCT2 and PARC onto MAP. And we thought we were doing that. We thought it would work great. And these are the results that we came out with, and this was the baseline that we set, and it was going to be this way going forward, right? So then came along the next year, and we had, in the next year, we had park to map, still in the high schools because of banking. But we had map to map growth measures in districts and 700-point schools. And we saw, oops, that bridge scale didn't really equate what we were looking for. It's not comparable. We can't compare what the bridge scale equated to actual map to map results. And so then we said, okay, we got to reset the baseline again. So we reset the baseline not only for districts, all three scales were reset: district, 700-point schools, and 1,000-point schools, using the data that we had on hand at the time. At the time, the high schools still had park to map in the majority of the growth calculation. So that brings us to this year. This is the first year we've had map to map results. We didn't need to change the scales for districts and 700-point schools. We had map to map for the majority, for all 700-point schools the prior year, and majority of the cases of measurements of performance in the districts. Where we had the problem was in the 1,000-point schools. We had park to map last year, and it's not comparable in measuring map to map this year. So here we've come back again. We're not wanting to change the baseline for districts and 700-point schools, but we need to do it for 1,000-point schools in order to make sure that we have a reference point that we can use moving forward. So we can compare the results from this year to next year and going forward. And so, again, I want to emphasize, as was brought up, percentiles are not static. It is not a fixed percent that are going to be A, B, C, D, and F. We'd like to see no schools being an F, no districts being an F. But what we need to do is set the baseline and leave it, and not have significant changes to the accountability system that would merit a reset of a baseline, and move forward and let the distribution fall where it does. And that's what we're seeing here in the 700-point school distribution. You can see a significant deviation from those initial percentiles that were established.
This is a good break before we get to the next part of the slides to do questions. And Dr. Vanford, look like you're about to say something, but one thing that I want to make it clear is the resetting of the base cut scores are causing the resetting of the percentiles to start the percentages anew. And so it would stand to reason that, barring unforeseen circumstances, if the cut scores stay the same, that hopefully everybody moves up to AB until we trigger the 65% in law, and then we reset it by law, not by extenuating circumstances, namely park to map, etc. My question is, and this is where I think there's sensitivity on the board, because it looks like we're just arbitrarily doing this. There are rationale behind each of these cut score changes. So projecting into the future, in this year, do you see any sense, just, I know this is parlor game, do you see any scenario in which this board would have to consider cut scores again, which if we have to for extenuating circumstances, that's our job, we'll do it. But are there things coming down the pike that we should be aware of and preparing for and talking about right now?
Component will be part of the accountability system as part of the official grades. We ran the EL component and provided data to the districts. So next year the EL component will count as a part of the district's grade, and we also will have a new science assessment. So
if we don't change the cut scores, then we'll look like Florida, where you have the dips.
We're not saying that would force a change. I was just responding that
those are
anything
external
that would potential. But until
what would happen if we didn't change them?
It look like Florida. You'd have that dip, right? That these things happen.
No.
Review. We would have to have the data to see as a result.
Let's look at historical data then. When we did that in algebra, we talked about this before, that it dropped from 70% to 40%. That's not true necessarily with this, but it's going to drop some. So now you're down 20 points. I'm going to say right there, and that's being gracious. And now the EL component, I can tell you the two schools that I'm looking at, that's dropped from 15 to 20 points. So you're 40 points down. No way to keep that same scale.
Well, one of the things that we're doing with the EL, which we mentioned earlier, and you're going to see it on the next few slides, we did not add points for EL. So deliberately, so that we did not have to change 700-point schools and 1,000-point schools and districts. And so what you'll see on the next few slides. Now, what we are looking at, so that should not impact the data by the calculation of EL because we're not exceeding the 700 and 1,000 point schools and districts.
But it's points that we don't get.
Where'd you
Points
get
that
the
we
points
could not
from?
attain.
So one thing that we're looking at under the Accountability Task Force is looking at is the calculation of EL. So that we know we are going to look at, and that's on the task force agenda, is to look at how it's calculated. We have no choice about the EL component. Let's be very clear about that. So what we have choice over is how we then calculate that, because it does right now count 5% of your total score. So how we calculate it, we could look at, but we have no option about not to include it.
Understand.
So that's what we're looking at now. Now, the other thing that Paula mentioned about the new science assessment, apparently in years past, so this must have been BC before Carrie, there was a policy that said anytime you administer a new test in the first year, that schools and districts are basically held harmless until that full year's worth of data and the assessment is administered again before we even look at that. So that's something that we're looking at, is to bring a policy before you that would allow that and also help mitigate, quite honestly, the new science assessment, because right behind that you have a new U.S. history assessment. And so we're looking down the road to say that's probably the last new assessment we're going to have because we changed those standards. So we're trying to anticipate what the Accountability Task Force has to be looking at that would not then require a reset of our cut scores.
Franklin.
So if I understand correctly, then using the EL next year, it'll only penalize you. It's not going to enrich you.
No. That's why we're looking at its calculation.
That's not.
Well, but that statement's not true, so I need to stop you there. That's part of what we have to look at in this component, because the component has got to be fair and it's got to be transparent. Because I've got school districts, one of whom raised his hand today in a meeting I was at, that said, Superintendent that's here, said, I have none. Well, and then I got Corey Elselton on the phone, who says, I've got 1,750. So it's got to be, and there's schools that have less than 10, there's some that have 200, 500, doesn't make any difference. How we calculate that has got to be fair and transparent, whether I have 0 or I'm sitting in DeSoto with 750 kids. That's what the task force is now looking at, is the calculation of that. That has to be looked at in order for to avoid what Mr. Bailey is concerned about, which is its fairness.
Equitable side, yes, ma'am.
And
My other question was, who determined that it's 5%?
So the federal government told all states that it had to be a sufficient weight. We took a look. We've got a little over 3% of our population, and it is growing, of ELs. That's about 3% plus. So we knew that we had to have sufficient weight. So for us, we thought 5%, knowing we've got a growing population, that seemed to be a fair percentage out of the entire model to donate 5%. And so as of now, the feds have agreed that that is sufficient weight. If you recall, hang on one second. If you recall, when we submitted this, it was right after I got here, and we only wanted to count graduation for 100 points in the model. And the feds pushed back and said, no, that is not sufficient weight. You have got to make this sufficient weight. And that's when we changed it in the model, and it now counts 200 points, because they were taking a look at our graduation rates, which were horrible. And they said, no, you've got to make it count for more than that. So we increased that. So right now the feds have given us the okay for 5% based on a 3.5% population, and that's how we did it. No. And different states, I mean, Florida, I have no idea. I mean, Dr. Hovenius, you may know, Florida's calculation for EL percentage-wise might be bigger than 5%. Do you know?
It is. It's 100 points and an 1,100 point calculation for high school, and 100 points and an 800 point calculation for middle, 100 and 700 for elementary.
So there you go.
Again, unintended consequence, but the way they're calculating, the way it's been calculated right now, you'd have a high school situation, and again, they have to X out of loss of links within 5 years. They come to the high school already having been in the program 5 years. no way to win that. No, you can't attain those points any way you look at it. As many as 20 students. So I don't know how to tell a high school to help that student attain whatever that goal would be, because we're going to continue to put them through maps and the whole 9 yards there. But instructionally, those schools are in that calculation. I don't want to use the word penalized, but they can't get those points.
That's why we're looking at the calculation of EL.
The other thing that I would say to that.
Oh yeah, that's why you've got the accountability task force, so that they can take a look at this, and Dr. Hovenitz guides that group, as well as Dr. Domaleski, to take a look at how we're calculating it to make sure that it's fair and equitable. I mean, that's got to be done. So that's what and then it'll go to our technical advisory committee, and then it will go to the commission, and then it will come to you finally for a final approval.
Actually, the accountability task force that made the 5% recommendation. I mean, the accountability task force worked to flesh out the EL component, and we committed then to revisit the calculation after running the data for the 17-18 school year and using it for the school improvement designation. So it's been our intent all along.
Yeah, I think one other point I want to make about running, and the reason we ran it with and without EL is because we wanted to know what was the impact, and we also wanted to get feedback from districts. Because if we'd waited until 18 or 19, you would have had no idea how this EL component was going to impact your school.
Miss Ryan.
Mississippi.
This is a very difficult stuff.
That went out for an RFP, just like all statewide assessment systems do.
Doug's.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment. This is really good information and good learning for me. I understand completely. I would just say that listening to the districts, the major struggle point is the change point. We're changing again. We're changing again. We're changing again. Boy, this year we're changing again. And if you look, we're going to change again. And the next year we're going to probably change again. So I think your comments you made earlier, we really need to take back bridging the change point and how it impacts, and not just cut and say you drop and cut you drop, or you don't always drop, but for a lot of districts they drop, so they may stop running as fast. We got to be careful with the momentum that they built. And if you were a B and you drop down to C, will they still have that full head of steam? I'm talking about for the change point, the cut, or something that we need to get done. We know we got to get it done, but how do we come up with an approach that will not impact them as much that first year?
Let me say something. I might come to Dr. Kelly, but this is the critical point that I see. We will have to make a decision in the coming, 8, 9, 10 months, however long it is, to change, once again, the cut scores because of the impact of EL and science. And by doing that, we're jamming back into the 14%, 10%, this theory that there's a, hidden agenda to do quotas. Okay, if we change it, then we're going to force that to restart, which is wholly unfair for those to the point of making progress. Or we don't, that's our decision, and then those schools that are impacted by EL in a major league way and science in a major league way, might have been an A or B or C, they go down. And so it's one or the other. We can do nothing and let them.
No, I'm by any means saying don't do anything.
But there's a lot of people that
how do we bridge the impact? Bridge may not be the right word, but
I'm saying we have a decision to make to do nothing or to change it. Those are the only two things that can do based on the bringing on of the new EL and the science piece to this. And there's consequences for each. By restarting it, then we shove back into this, restarted. And so you're trying to, look like you've got 10% and 14%. Or we don't do anything, and schools that have historically, traditionally done really well are going to feel the pain of this, and they're going to be pushed down. And I point back to the Florida model. You see, as these external factors are impacting 9 times over 19 years, you see that they go up and down based on what's happening. Okay. So we could certainly choose to do nothing, or we can reset the baseline, right? Is that our options?
Hang on a second. Dr. Hovenitz, I think you wanted to say something.
So I just want to say, one, it was intentional that Florida made those changes and increased the rigor. Like they explicitly made a decision that said, we want to expect more from students and more from our schools, so we're implementing these changes to make it a more rigorous system. The other thing to remember too is when you're adding indicators, you're looking to eliminate systemic bias rather than actual performance. So if you put in an EL indicator where everybody went up or everybody went down, it's not a very good indicator because you're looking at a systemic bias. The system indicator is biasing results. There will be differences in performance in EL students based on what school they're in. I mean, there's differences in performance of all students based on what schools they're in. It's not just unique to EL. And then the other thing to remember is when you're looking at impact data from this year or from last year from EL performance, it's just like any other assessment data. It's unmotivated data. It's not data that's been included in an accountability system. It's just reality data. And so when you're looking at it from the impact perspective and looking at some baseline data, it's technically unmotivated data. And when you're doing that, when you're field testing or an assessment or looking at assessment results for the first time, you typically see a 3 to 5% increase in whatever you're measuring, just because it was unmotivated when you got your baseline data versus being motivated before. And I draw you back to the example where I showed you from 99 to 2000 to 2001 in Florida when we did our A through F school grading system. We didn't change expectations for proficiency. We didn't change the number of points needed to earn an A, B, or C. We didn't change the test. We didn't change the standards. And you saw that huge improvement because it was motivated data versus reality. So 99 was reality. 2001, that's when the motivation kind of kicked in and demonstrated. So just be cautious as you're looking at impact data and saying we don't want to impact these schools for what's currently happening, because we want that to improve. I mean, there's been an acknowledgement in Mississippi that EL students might not be getting as much attention and support as they deserve. And that's not just unique to Mississippi, that's across the country. And that's why this is part of ESSA, is because traditionally they haven't been getting the support and help that they need. Their performance is depressed and they're not making the progress that they need. And then kind of the last thing to remember too, this is an English language progress indicator. They're looking at whether or not students are making progress. So it's not looking at whether or not they're proficient, it's whether they're making progress towards proficiency. So it's just not a hard and fast, yes, you're proficient, no, you're not proficient. So that too kind of softens it for the districts that do have a lot of really low performing EL students.
Franklin.
Guys have the scientific and the technology deal that Buster and I don't have out in Bolton. Have y'all looked at districts, how many improved from this year's score using the EL number? Because when I look, and I think I looked just at the districts, because there's a lot of pages, not a single one improved. Now, like I say, you guys, have y'all looked at that with your computers and all?
That's the reason, as Dr. Wright alluded to earlier, that we're going back to look at the calculation of that component in the model before the 18-19 school year results.
Okay. Yes, sir. Next slide.
Okay, so not to belabor the point, but I wanted to circle back and
Sure.
say we do have schools that have 100%. They have earned 100% of their EL points. At least 90% of their EL students are meeting progress goals, so it does occur. Schools.
But I said, I think I looked at district. That's the first thing you gave us.
We have districts that are very close to being at that level.
And before we leave slide 38, I just wanted to point out back to a comment that Mr. Bailey made regarding the percentage of A and B districts. So if you look, this is our pending data approval for 17-18, but we would have roughly 40% of our districts that are A and B districts combined, and we referenced the 58% of A and B districts in Florida, and we would have 52% A and B districts in Mississippi.
Making more reference to 1,000 point schools where that percentage is way different. my point.
Okay, keep going.
My point is too, though, that an A school ought to mean something. When we reset it, people who earn an A, it ought to mean that they're doing excellent work. I mean, we could dumb it down to where we have lots of schools that are A's, schools to be A's, but an A school or a B school or a C school ought to mean something in the great scheme of things.
Yeah, a top performing school
Yeah,
or
should be
district.
yeah.
So, and you know, there was the other question was whether or not we have to reset the baseline because of science or EL. It's important to note the percentage of points that those components count in the accountability model. You'll notice that growth has a very large percentage of points in the accountability model. Thus, whenever we have a problem with the growth calculation, yes, we've got to reset the baseline. That's a significant impact. When we're looking at science or we're looking at EL, those are smaller percentage of points. So this is the table for 700-point schools, and this is an example of an A 700-point school. We mentioned some examples earlier. You'll see this school has about half of their students scoring proficient in reading and math, but they are growing their students. They have very high rates of growth. More students than not are growing their proficiency rate than the school. And you'll see their science proficiency rate is almost at 80%. And their progress to proficiency for EL students is at 28 points out of 35. In contrast, you have an actual F 700-point school, and you see their proficiency rates are some of the lowest in the state in reading and math. And even though their proficiency rates are so low, they're not growing the majority of their students. So you see growth rates on average that are lower than 50%. So their students are not proficient and they're not growing. And also their EL progress is less than half of the points. So for 1,000-point schools and districts, again, I'll point out science here is only 5% of the points in the accountability model, like EL. And this also applies to districts. So we would not expect to see a significant impact based on those topics that we discussed. And then we have an example here of an actual A 1,000-point school. Again, you're going to see good proficiency rates among their students. And strong growth rates among their students. So that not only are more than half of their students proficient, but they're growing their students. This school doesn't have a particularly stellar graduation rate, but they're still an A high school because of their proficiency and growth rates. So again, when we talk about those performance level descriptors, they may be doing great in one area and not so great in another, but the things weigh out each other. Schools can be performing very well in some components and maybe need improvement in others, but still have opportunity to shine as the higher performing school or district. It doesn't have to all come from one, or it doesn't have to come from every component. Yes, ma'am.
Look at you, not by you, I mean you or your staff. Do you look at each of these? I'm particularly interested in the low-performing schools. Do you look at each of those and they all kind of stack up the same, that it's both proficiency and growth?
We do see similarities.
There's not schools that are all over the map. In other words, they have low proficiency but very high growth.
Yeah, we do have schools that have low proficiency and high growth. But they're not at the F level because they're getting credit for that growth measure. So you're going to see those more in the C category. It just depends on to what extent is that proficiency low. But yeah, we definitely do have schools that are growing and showing great growth. And, you know, they're not a D or an F.
I'm talking about categories, the 712s and the K-12, the attendance center components. I want to put that on the table and just say there's 31 of those, 41 of 712. Not a single one of them made an A, not a single one of them made a B. The high score they got to C. Just don't fit the model for some reason. Same K-12s, I don't think there was a single A. There were some Bs in that. So that's 76 of our schools, that's approximately 31% of our schools, somehow or another don't fit that model, and therefore can't show progression in a way that's not discouraging, I'll say. So certainly would like the task force to take a hard look at the attendance center aspect of it, the 7-12, as well as the K-12.
Have a task force that's currently working on that. It initially began with a K-12 configuration, but the data requests and the work that that group is doing has expanded beyond. And so now we're looking at all configurations that include a grade 12 that are not the traditional high school. And so we were scheduled to meet following the board meeting, but the data that we need for that was not approved by the board, so we have postponed that meeting until the 2018 accountability results are
So
final.
That's the reason you didn't convene last Thursday.
Correct. That's the last, that's a separate task force, Mr. Bailey. It's separate and apart from accountability. It's a task force unto itself to look at just what you just described. And then that will feed into the accountability task force for them to take a look at.
Thank you.
Yeah, but we did need the finalized data before we could meet. Yeah.
Okay, and then we have an example of an F 1,000-point school again, so you can kind of see what a school that gets an F looks like as far as proficiency and growth. You'll note that math proficiency at 7.2 points. Okay, so we have other indicators. I think we've mentioned in an earlier slide that we measure in acceleration, college career readiness, and graduation rates. And we've talked a pretty good bit about the new English learner component. There are a lot of nuances to this component, and as we've mentioned, we are going to discuss the component. I think what's clear and what everybody needs to understand at this point is that it's a federal requirement, and then we've got to measure progress towards proficiency for EL students. We're going to have, you know, a goal of exiting the EL program, and then some way of measuring progress towards meeting that goal. I think those are things that are factual that we can assume, regardless of what we discuss this year. So, let's skip on.
Now, aren't the feds giving us more flexibility in those type of discussions than they had previously?
Around EL? No.
No, there has not been.
Not EL. Not EL at all.
EL is a required component in the model under ESSA.
Now, how we put it in the model is up to each state. That's the flexibility. So not all 50 states are going to have it in their model the exact same way, but we have no flexibility around not putting it in the model. Yeah.
Got to have an EL, but how we do it.
Lists 25%, and then it's in the all students for proficiency and growth, and there's no way around that because you can't pull them out by policy and separate them out. So it gets counted three times.
They are measured in proficiency and growth just like any other student, and then they have this additional measure.
Keep in mind the proficiency and growth calculations are based on MAP. That is the Mississippi Academic Assessment Program. The EL component is based on the loss length that we discussed earlier.
Okay, Ms. McClellan.
That is required.
What caused the confusion on there's a perception out there that the lower 25% is being counted 3 times based on what you said. What is the misconception on that?
The lowest 25%?
Right.
Well, they're counted in the growth of the lowest 25%. But if you happen to be in the lowest 25%, you're also going to count in growth overall. So you've got 4 buckets in our accountability model that measure growth.
I think there's
and the lower 25%.
So do you have flip back a slide. Flip back to slide. Flip back to slide 39.
What page is that?
20. Let's just use this as a perfect example because they're all the same. The points are different within the 700 point, but if you look at slide 39 and then you look at slide 42, which is on the next page on 21. So if you look at on 39, these are the actual points. These are the actual points that are in the model. So if you look at this as a 700-point elementary and middle. So you see reading, you have proficiency is measured in reading, math, and science. So those are 3 separate buckets all by themselves. Then you measure the growth of all students in those schools in reading, and you measure the growth of all students in those schools in math. And you also measure the growth of the lowest 25% of those students in reading and the growth of the lowest 25% of those students in math. So the model, when it was designed, and Senator Tolleson can tell you that, and Dr. Hovins can certainly tell you that, with Mississippi being on the absolute bottom of the state of the United States in terms of education and education growth, they built in growth components so that you could see are students growing, or all students growing, but more importantly, those students at the bottom that need the help the most, are they growing? So that's the reason we wanted to show you what was happening in some of these schools. So if you go to slide just quickly to 41, 41. Take a look at here's what I'm saying. This is what Alan was, 21, slide 41.
That's where we're.
It's at the top. Okay. You can see here, Mr. McClellan, that this school not only has incredibly low proficiency rates of 15.7 in reading and 14.6 in math. This is an actual school. But they've got, other than the growth in reading, they've got less than 50% of their children showing growth. Only 38.5% of their kids are showing growth in math, and only 47.2 are showing growth in reading. So that's a school that is low in proficiency and low in growth. So when districts get these results back, and this school will, just like the 1,000-point school, they're going to have to take a look and see, where do we earn the most points and where do we earn the least? And wherever we earn the least, that needs some attention on our part. So if I'm the principal at this elementary school and I'm looking at only 15.7% of all of my children are proficient in reading, that's a significant piece to me to let me know, what am I going to be doing programmatically different for those children that's going to help them reach proficiency? So it's not counted more, it's built in deliberately to pay attention to those kids that need the help the most.
Look at the different boxes. The lower 25 is in every one of those.
Yeah. No, you're looking at 4 boxes.
They're not in the proficiency?
Well, that's not growth. So proficiency, they're in proficiency, but that's different than growth. Right.
In most cases, your lowest 25 is not going to score proficient.
Right.
So we can assume that in most cases.
True.
The question was, how many different times is the lower 25 included in the model, wasn't it, Mr. McClellan?
Right.
And it could be in 4 boxes. It could be in the growth of all and the growth of, 4. Mm-hmm.
But I may be the lowest 25, in the lowest 25% of growth in math, but not in reading, or
That's
vice
right.
versa. So
Right.
in that case, I would only be
Up to 4.
Possible
Right.
buckets, though. They're
Up to 4.
Up to 4.
Yeah.
Say that again.
Well, a student may be in the bottom 25% in math, but they may not be in the bottom 25% of reading. They could be one or both, or neither. The same.
So in other words, I could be on grade level in mathematics. I could be proficient in math. So I'm not in the lowest 25% because I'm proficient. So that doesn't put me in that bottom category. But you know what? In reading, I really struggle. And so I am in the lowest 25% because I am so not proficient in reading, and I'm even below proficiency in reading. So I could be in that low 25% in reading because I just am not on grade level and not reading. But I'm doing okay in math, and if I'm proficient, then I'm not in the lowest 25%. That's right.
So that child would not be counted in the lowest 25% in the math bucket.
Right, but they would be counted
in reading.
in reading. Mm-hmm.
Hey, just somebody else have a? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Dr. Hovins.
So I also just want to make the point that this is obviously a very deliberate design. Part of the concern with adequate yearly progress and making sure all kids reached proficiency was, if you're just measuring growth for all students, you're just going to focus on the kids that are really close to achieving proficiency. If you focus on the lowest performing kids, you will ensure that they focus on all kids reaching growth, even though they're really far ways away from proficiency. because they're going to get credit for those students. So all kids, whether it's the lowest 25% or not, are included in the model multiple times. They're included for proficiency indicators, they're included for graduation indicators, they're included for growth indicators, and the reason why we do the lowest 25% is everybody gets focused on. Otherwise, we found that a lot of kids get left behind if you're only focusing on growing kids to get to proficiency rather than growing all kids across the spectrum.
That's
Got just a couple more slides, and then we can get to rapid fire round. So if you just get to, I think we're stopped on slide.
Oh, right here. So I was going to briefly
data, the process.
Yeah, I was going to briefly point out the process that we go through in confirming the data, how we make sure that accountability results are correct. So we start with our assessment data that we get in from our assessment vendors. It goes through to the districts for review. They have a review period for that. Then we pull the monthly submissions from MSIS and combine the assessment data with the MSIS data. We send out preliminary accountability results to the districts for review. There's a review period for that. Then there's an internal review process where we look at their submissions and whether or not the data is accurately reflected. We apply any changes that are necessary, and then final results are produced. So there is quite a bit number of checks that we go through. That's not even to mention all the quality assurance checks that we go through with just the data processes. So in this last piece, I just want to point out, again, we've already touched on this, accountability drives results, and we also see accountability drives equity, and I want to re-emphasize the goals and the strategic plan and how they apply to accountability, and that is that all students are proficient and showing growth in all assessed areas, that every student graduates from high school and is ready for college and career, and that every school and district is rated a C or a higher. So that's the goals. That's what we're striving for. That's what the accountability system is designed to do. So yes, there's emphasis on the lowest performing students. We want to drive performance in the lowest performing group and improve the outcome of every student. Poverty is not a barrier to achievement. Is there a correlation between poverty and performance? Yeah, there's a correlation. Is it a causation? Is it necessary? No, it's not. We see that 12 out of 18 of the state's A-rated districts have more than 50% of their students qualifying for free or reduced lunch, which is what we use to measure economic disadvantaged students. The majority of students, are greater than 75%, of 40 B and C rated districts qualify for free and reduced lunch, and that's on this next slide. This is a listing of districts with high rates of poverty. It's based on free and reduced lunch, and the fact that they are meeting or exceeding the goal established by the State Board of Education to be rated a C or higher. So what's next? We've talked about some of these. The new accountability task force will be formed for 2018-19. We're working on confirming those members now. We're going to look at considerations for additional measures of college and career readiness. As I mentioned earlier, ACT is the only measure we have in place for now, so we're going to look at some additional measures for students that maybe aren't necessarily college bound that we can include in there. We're going to consider the EL calculation and whether or not it's fair and equitable for districts, and if there's anything that we can do better to better formulate that calculation. However, we will have an EL component, and it will measure progress of EL students in meeting federal requirements. And then there's going to be the new K through 12 task force that we've spoken about to look at attendance centers or schools that have the full grade configuration band from K through 12, and whether or not there's some type of disparity with their grading. Again, when we create these grade scales, we want to look at apples to apples. That's the goal. Maybe there's a possibility here that we need to look at if there's something that's affecting these schools that have this particular grade configuration.
Thank you all for that. Just kind of open it up for general questions that might not have been fully covered, or I will say I think probably the majority, if not everybody on the board, has received emails, phone calls, texts, Snapchats, Instagram, Telegram from the operators and the practitioners about this process. And I will just say again to those here present and the 70 or so that are watching online, this is an organic process to some degree, and we have these sessions so that we feel confident and we understand it well enough to make the decisions that are put before us, but also to understand what might be coming around the corner and try and prepare for that and be responsive in the best way that we possibly can. You guys have done a fantastic job. You've covered the vast majority of the issues that I've kind of summarized, and I call that like a thematic, things that I keep hearing over and over again from the practitioners. But there are a couple of things that I think were not in the presentation, and again, I call this the rapid fire portion of today's game. But if you can maybe talk about the ACT and talk about it in two different ways. Obviously, ACT as a means for testing at the high school. I think issues around how do you look at proficiency and growth around the ACT, given how it's stood up and how it measures against our standards. But also one issue that was brought to my attention I've not thought about is in our Mississippi career and college readiness, how can the work keys possibly be considered into that? So with that, let me kind of start off with big chunk on ACT, and y'all, if you have additional questions. Just
Alan, while you're looking at that, I do want to respond to that with work keys, because that's really what he was referencing. Because right now, ACT is really a college readiness measure, and a lot of businesses are asking us to take a look at work keys. So that's something that the Accountability Task Force is going to be looking at as well, to embed work keys.
We have those ACT scores in yet?
They are embargoed until the end of the year, end of the month. We're going to hopefully bring that to you in November for a board item, so you'll see what they are.
I want a quick deal here. If you could go back to page 10, slide 19, I want to ask a question just for clarification, and it's on this scale score for fourth grade reading. And I know in 2011, 2013, we did a drop in that. What year did we start the third grade reading gate? Oh, slide
19.
You're right. You're right. The fourth grade reading at the lower left.
The law passed in the 2013 session, and implementation started in the 13-14 school year. So that spring 13 would have been before any coaching or professional development took place. Yes, sir. So 2015 would be the first year where the NAEP results were reflective of the work that had gone into Literacy-Based Promotion Act.
So that's probably the reason why we see that dip, you think?
So the fourth grade reading scores at the bottom left increased from 2013 to 2015.
Wait a minute now, we're in the blue line?
Now the light blue line is the nation. The light blue is the nation. The dark blue is Mississippi.
That's what
I was looking at it on the screen. It's easier to see on the screen.
Yeah, see, we went up. So sorry, jump up. Went up
from a 209.
Right here on the bottom deal.
No, look up. Yeah.
Mississippi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the blue after
there's a dip there, right?
Starting in 2015. No, right here. Yeah. This is fourth grade reading. So the literacy-based promotion.
Oh, I got you. I'm good. I'm good. My.
His glasses weren't moving right.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Alan, you got that slide?
Yes. So
okay.
I'm prepared to answer your question about ACT. Let me pull up that. So there are assessment requirements that we have as part of federal law. Probably the biggest barrier to using the ACT in lieu of end-of-course statewide standard assessments is the fact that the ACT is not designed to measure the state standards that we have established in Mississippi. I've been to ACT. I've talked with ACT. They have basically said that their assessment is their assessment. It's designed to do what it's designed to do. It's not designed to measure performance in this manner. It's not designed to measure state established standards, and they don't intend to make it do that. There's been several states that have attempted to make it work in such a way that it will pass peer review and federal requirements. They have not been successful, and I have a couple of slides about that. So as you know, there are some flexibility or some language about flexibility in federal law regarding assessments in high schools. However, there are requirements that the assessment must meet in order to be approved, and it has to go through this process. The state has to fund it and support it, and then it has to go through federal review process, peer review process, and it has to meet all of the federal requirements. So this is some of the ones that we've mentioned. It has to be aligned and address the breadth and depth of the state academic standards. It has to provide coherent and timely information about student attainment and state academic standards at a student's grade level. It has to be equivalent in its content coverage, difficulty, and quality as compared to the state's other assessments. And it has to produce individual student interpretive, descriptive, and diagnostic reports regarding achievement on the assessments that allow parents, teachers, and principals and other school leaders to understand and address the specific academic needs of students. Now, this language comes directly from federal regulation. And in this last bullet that we were looking at here, it's speaking to our reporting requirements that really break down the detail of the performance and the groups of students that have to be reported. And you'll see a lot of that data presented on our report cards when they come out. Specifically here, you'll see it has to provide for disaggregated results for the state and district by each major racial and ethnic group, economically disadvantaged students. It has to provide for accommodations for students with disabilities, students that have English proficiency challenges with their English proficiency status. It has to be unbiased, rational, and consistent in its differentiation between and among schools within the state. So again, those are things that we're looking at, like test content, item types, whether or not they have any bias in their questioning. And again, that's a peer review process. They have to meet ESSA's requirements for assessments that's outlined in the regulation, as you see. And as I mentioned, they have to go through federal peer review. And I touched on this. ACT is not designed to measure the depth and content of Mississippi College career readiness standards. MDE would have to commission and fund an external independent audit to determine the alignment of ACT with Mississippi College career ready standards. This would be a very costly process. It's one that other states are trying to do but have not been successful doing. And so we wouldn't recommend doing this until ACT has cleared peer review in other states. Again, I touched on ACT results are not reported in the same manner as Mississippi assessment results and wouldn't meet the reporting requirements. But we do use ACT in our accountability model. It's used in the college career readiness component, and it is in the graduation options. So I mentioned what some other states have done. Here's a slide that talks about that. Thus far, there's no state that's been approved to use ACT as the test to demonstrate proficiency. A few states have tried, specifically Alabama, Kentucky, Wisconsin, Wyoming, and none have been approved. Wyoming has since withdrawn its request. So after being turned down, they've withdrawn their efforts. To use ACT as the state test, it has to be peer reviewed by the U.S. Department of Education, demonstrate several features including alignment, validity, reliability, accessibility, and security. And it's not just ACT, it's also SAT, and SAT is having challenges with this. I believe we have an article in your materials about Connecticut and their attempts to use SAT as their nationally recognized assessment in lieu of state assessments for high schools. Just some other, there's another article here mentioned here that I thought we think would be relevant. I don't know if we printed that one out though, but you've got the link there if you want to go and look it up
So you're saying there's a chance. All right, next. We got it. Roll on.
Document that just came out this past week is the ESSA flexibilities document. Addresses assessments, etc. And it in the original ESSA guidelines, it said you can utilize assessments, and it said ACT and the SAT. It didn't say you could. It just said such as ACT and those. And here it says a state has broad discretion to select the assessments and assessment items that are aligned with its academic content standard and measures what the state expects students in the state to know and be able to do. And it goes on. There's a good bit of stuff about what you can do with assessments.
And going back to the
Right.
second bullet on the slide, pulling from the law, we could use it if we could.
If it went through peer review and got passed through peer review.
Demonstrates those features such as alignment, validity, reliability.
Real quick, how would you measure growth? Let's just pretend we're in La La Land. We're using ACT. How do you show growth? Is that a requirement, an SSOU proficiency based on the benchmarks?
Dr. Hovanitz, you want to answer that?
So there's no particular requirement that the state measures growth or uses growth in any way, so that's not necessarily consideration. One of the things, ACT is a forms test, so you would actually have to go in and set benchmarks and achievement level if you can get past the alignment issue. I know we like talking about Common Core state standards, but there are a lot of states that adopted Common Core state standards, including Florida, made a few changes to them, went through the review process like Mississippi did. Our standards are very similar in Florida as they are in Mississippi. Florida had a $582,000 alignment study performed for them that basically said that ACT doesn't align. So it was external study done, and they're not the only state that has done this type of thing. And so their legislature was very interested in fewer, better tests, making sure that we're measuring something that matters to people. And after that alignment study came back and the amount of work that would have to be done by ACT to get a college reportable score, which is the other issue, it didn't make any sense. So essentially what ACT would have to do is create a state assessment, which would be different than the college assessment. So you would end up with a score that was not reportable to get you into university if you went the ACT route right now and had to augment it with your state standards. It's something that Michigan did like 6 years ago, and they dropped it because it got too expensive to do little testlets and insert into their state assessment that was ACT plus, essentially, and they didn't always yield reportable scores. Accommodations was also a huge issue. They didn't provide the appropriate accommodations, which also made scores non-college reportable for a lot of students that were using accommodations that weren't permissible in college reportable scores. So there are a lot of things. It wasn't one thing, but the alignment thing is the first and foremost thing. And then there's 18 other things that Alan mentioned about security, validity, breadth, depth, all of the other security issues that go around with it too. So, and you do use ACT for college and career readiness. I mean, you're using it, everybody gets the universal administration and the benefit of using ACT, which is a great thing. And so you have more measures for your high school calculations, and you get a free administration, essentially, for students, so they know if they're going to be taught or not.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to take up all the space. Any other, Johnny?
Had this discussion previously. Heard, my whole thing is we currently now give 4 subject area tests at a cost of, it's difficult to determine. I'm thinking, from what I've looked at, about $1 million each. We give the ACT, and it costs us 1.3 or 4. But you give those, and look at the number of days, and if you look at the subject area test, and the days, and then the retest, et cetera, and so forth. Now, that is a big issue with a lot of folks, the number of testing days that we have and the time we're taking to do it. But at the end of the day, how many folks have ever heard of the subject, and what does it predict or what does it do? It doesn't do anything. ACT at least gives a predictor of college success, and it's also utilized by universities and colleges for entrance. So what we basically do now is we give the subject area tests that are not connected, I guess you could say they're connected to our standards, but then what does the score do? What door does it open, or who pays any attention to it? I'll hush.
Kelly.
I have a couple of comments. First, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the department for this incredible learning opportunity. Charles and I were around when this accountability system was built, and I have to tell you, I don't know about Charles, every time I'm educated on it, I learn a little bit more about it. I have a binder here, and it's really everybody I heard from the top of the state to the bottom of the state on this issue. So, and I've read every one of them. I know this issue is important to those of you that work in the field. I feel it. I can say that by having been better informed today, I'm able to empathize with what all of you are feeling. I see this thing from a lot of different perspectives. I have to say that I think we have to learn to trust our process and our processes. I heard this group talk about our task force, the TAC, the Commission on School Accreditation, and I heard Dr. Hovines talk about her experience in Florida. And the most telling part of that for me, and I asked the question because I wanted to hear it from her, the most telling part of that was how she talked about them having changed their rating system 10 times. She talked about changing it 10 times. And I've gone back and looked at this document, and it talked about what they changed every time they changed it. He also gave us some indication of how the field responded. And they responded much like our educators from around the state have responded to this. But I also heard her say, every time it was changed, they didn't run away from it. They embraced the change, and they increased the rigor. And I, you know, Florida was one of those states for a long time, those of us in Mississippi could look at and say, oh, there's somebody else in the category with us. But I venture to say, if you look at what's happened in Florida over the last 20 years, it's anything short of remarkable. So for me, and this is for me only, I'll use a sport analogy. For me, it's not a sprint, but it has to be a marathon. We have to look at it and continue to train, and that's what we're doing. We're training, and every year hope that we get better at this. And if Florida is any indication, and some of the other states around the country that have also done what Florida has done, Kentucky is another one that comes to mind. They've stayed with it. They've stayed with it. As painful as it was at the time, they've stayed with it. And they are looked at as models and leaders in education today. So this was a good process. It was a learning opportunity for me. And again, thank you for it.
Sir, other comments, Mr. Frank?
I want to share. I too have gotten, you're talking about you, I have spent since Sunday afternoon, and I was gleefully approaching doing this because State beat Auburn Saturday night, so I came back from Starkville Sunday afternoon and I dove into this. But between emails, phone calls, etc., I want to share what I see, and we've already talked about some of them, but the folks out there, they deal with it all day, every day, and some of these I'm going to defer to Buddy because he's a practitioner. Everything I'm going to share here are concerns that practitioners who are out there who are affected by this every day deal with and are affected by it. And y'all, the results of these things are, it doesn't just affect a school or a district, it affects communities, it affects students, it affects everybody in that community when we do a rating, you know. And I don't resist. I think we just need to look at it and see. But here's some concerns I want to share. First, I said that from a system standpoint, we need a system that's fair, equitable for all students, and accurately represents what our schools are doing. That's a laudable goal. Then the first one, and the one that was repeated much, and there's nothing on here that was given to me just one time. These are multiple concerns. One was the Yale population, and we talked about that enough. The other, and again, refer to Buddy, on attendance centers. We desperately need to look at 70-something schools and not an A out there. And one potential solution that I'm going to just throw out was break everything down into K-12, K-5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12. And any school that falls into that gets the grade, as opposed to like now, you ignore, in looking at attendance centers, you ignore some grades. But the other schools that it affects are like K-2. If you go into my neighbor and I can advise, we get in Clinton, you've got schools there that don't test anybody, and the score that they get is based on students who left there either 1 or 3 years ago. So if you break it down and just say a K-5 in Clinton, then Clinton Park and East Side, whatever one got, and all, but you don't have to go back and try to pick out those students who were there a couple of years ago and all that. But anyway, that was a potential thing. Another was to look at support efforts from MDE to districts needing help. Look at ESSA federal funds and the flexibility with those. Model is too heavily weighted on growth versus performance. You've addressed that one. Needs to be balanced. Too much of an emphasis on the lower 25%. We've looked at that. Goal 6, no districts below C, is statistically unattainable. Stop resetting cut scores. Has a ripple effect. Stop using percentile ranks. Each reset places schools without regard to student performance. Forcing districts and schools to be competitive. Explore ACT and work keys. We just did that. Add a 5-year high school graduation cohort. If we change cut scores for high schools, should we change them for districts also? And that's what folks sent to me.
Comments before we conclude? All right, Dr. Hovnitz, thanks for your time.
Much.
Thanks to the board members for
safe travel, Christy.
Making an afternoon available for this. Thanks for the folks in the audience and the tens and tens of Mississippians watching online. We'll see y'all in 17 hours and 6 minutes.